Good morning, everybody. For the second time in 3 years, I have the honor of welcoming you to the early Sunday morning SMT graveyard shift. It's wonderful to see such a fine turnout. On behalf of all three of our speakers, I want to thank you so much for coming. I can assure you that you will be amply rewarded for rising to this occasion. The music to be explored this morning will indeed span what we call the long 19th century, beginning in 1827 with songs from Franz Schubert's Winterreise, and arriving in 1915 at Richard Strauss's Alpensinfonie, with a stopover in 1892 for two of Brahms's exquisite solo piano works. You'll be hearing about forms that reinforce visual illusions, about two kinds of ternary compositions, and about becoming, oscillation, and regression. I expect this session to be very lively and thought-provoking, and I hope that some of you will participate with a few genuine questions after each paper. So let's begin without any further delay. I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Jonathan Guez. Jonathan is an assistant professor at the College of Worcester in Ohio. He earned his PhD at Yale University, where his dissertation was co-advised by Pat McCreelys and James Hevakowski. His articles, book reviews, pedagogical materials can be found in a host of journals: the Journal of Schenkerian Studies, Music Theory Online, Music Analysis, Music Theory Spectrum, the Journal of Music Theory, and Music Theory Pedagogy Online. A forthcoming textbook with the working title Dictation is currently in production. As you can see, yes, you can see our title here today, Jonathan's title, Musical Form and Visual Illusion in Two Songs from Winterreise. Let's please welcome Jonathan.
Hello and welcome. Thanks for coming. It's nice to see so many people on this Sunday morning session. I open today with a long quotation about deep-level rhythm and narrative from Umberto Eco's faux literary critical postscript to The Name of the Rose. As you follow along with me, I ask you to take special note of the effects that what Eco calls rhythmic irregularities can have on the dramatic meaning of a novel. In narrative, Eco writes, the breathing is derived not from the sentences, but from the broader units, from the scansion of events. Harmony lies not in the length of the breath, but in its regularity. And if at a certain point the breathing breaks off and a chapter or a sequence ends before the breath is completely drawn, this irregularity can play an important role in the economy of the story. It can mark a turning point, a surprise development. At least this is what we find in great writers. A great novel is one in which the author always knows just when to accelerate, when to apply the brakes, and how to handle the clutch, within a basic rhythm that remains constant. Because they disrupt the deep-level rhythm of the work, such changes of speed can mark turning points and surprise developments. For Eco, as for so many others in the literary community, fewer in the musicological one, the regularity of a novel's rhythm or breathing is a source of aesthetic harmony. The disturbance of this regularity is a writerly means of creating narrative drama. This paper brings Eco's insight about the dramatic function of rhythmic irregularity into the realm of music, where I think that deep-level rhythmic disturbances also play important dramatic roles. In particular, I focus on Täuschung and Die Nebensonnen, two songs from the second half of Winterreise, whose titular visual illusions, a will-o'-the-wisp and a set of phantom suns, are brought to life by strategically placed disruptions of the musical breathing. Täuschung and Die Nebensonnen are both cast in rounded binary forms, A, B, A prime, and both their reprises are abbreviated relative to their referential expositions. In both songs, what is deleted in A prime is a portion of the interior of the referential A section. A prime begins like A, and it ends like A, but some amount of its middle is excised from the recapitulatory fabric, and the two ends are then stitched together. The stitching may be designed such that it minimizes any disjunctions of voice leading, but of course, it also alters the reprise's deep-level rhythm, especially when it's heard in relation to the referential A section. A clear example of the behavior can be found in an early song by Schubert, the familiar setting of Goethe's lyric, Erste Verlust. This slide shows the A and A prime sections only of that song. We'll listen to the A and A prime sections, and then we'll consider how Schubert negotiates the recapitulatory deletion. The B section. The deletion in A prime occurs at measures 19 and 20. It is unobtrusive because it combines and blends salient elements of two expositional events at measures 3 and 4 and measures 7 and 8. In the reprise, the first two beats of measure 19 equal the first two beats of measure 3, but the downbeat of measure 20 clearly already equals the downbeat of measure 8. This graphic aligns the A prime material of the song with its referential A material in a manner that facilitates comparison. Notice especially that measure 4 and 8 of the song's A section both feature climactic F5s in the vocal line and step descents from it. These features make for the possibility in A prime for the two F5s to be collapsed, or perhaps the best word is folded, into a single event. In the reprise, the music that equals measure 3 can move directly to the music that equals measure 8 through the buffering fact that measure 8 is approximately equal to measure 4. Taking my cue from echo, I want to argue that this cutting short of the reprise's breathing is tied up with a turning point or surprise development, that it marks a change in the song's dramatic temporality or contributes in an important way to its musical narrative. The acceleration is palpable for us as listeners, since the cadential goal of the song's reprise, which we expect to happen at a particular time point, comes strangely early. But the sense of early arrival may be palpable, too, to the virtual musical protagonist, in whose perception events or objects, real, remembered, or imagined, appear earlier than expected. In Erste Verlust, the acceleration may register the impatience of the lovelorn protagonist for delivery from the suffering that accompanies the loss of the beloved. And indeed, the early appearance of the goal cadence in the impossible A-flat major suggests a protagonist who wills the music as quickly as possible into the false tonic, in hopes of release from the objective tonic of the 4-flat universe. In our two Winterreise Lieder, Schubert conscripts the formal behavior found in Erste Verlust to help project scenarios of visual beguilement. Coupled with the score as landscape metaphor that has been so central to analysis of Schubert's music, these songs invite us to conceive their abbreviated recapitulations less in temporal and more in spatial terms, as distortions or wrinkles in a topography or terrain. The disruptions of the music's rhythmic breathing on this reading give access to the first-person perspective of the virtual winter wanderer. They stage in music the visual sense deceptions he experiences as he traverses the glaucous landscape. In Täuschung, the wanderer is confronted by a seductive dancing light, the Irrlicht returned from Song 9. Typical of ghost lights in romantic symbolism, it recedes when approached, enticing the wanderer to follow and luring him away from his path. At the crucial moment, the flicker offers the wanderer palliative visions of love and bourgeois comfort, a bright, warm house, a beloved soul within. And though these comforts have long since been lost to him, or perhaps because of this, the wanderer chooses willingly to follow. So let's pause to read the text. I will just point out to you that the lines there and on the left, the letters A, B, and A prime are Schubert's doing. When this poem appeared in print, it appeared as one undifferentiated stanza. In Schubert's reprise, The preoccupied, even somnambulant stumbling, is rendered in music by a hypermetrical irregularity. Measure 38 enters as a weak hyperbeat 4, but becomes on exit a strong hyperbeat 1. The rhythmic hiccup and the resulting 11-bar A prime section are especially marked in the context of the prevailing dance topos. They certainly contribute to what Bostridge has called the feeling of being slightly tipsily out of control. So let's listen to Bostridge sing this and see if he can pull this off.
Ihm weist ein helles, warmes Haus und eine liebe Seele drin, nur Täuschung ist für mich gering.
But there is more to the hypermetrical irregularity than the ways in which it musicalizes a stumbling gait. And the significance of the irregularity of A prime is best understood not by examining its immanent features, but by comparing it with the hypermetrically regular A section. The melody of the 16-bar A section divides neatly into two 8-bar phrases, and the second of these is musically identical with the first in every respect, except for its slightly intensified cadence at bar 19, with its leap up to the climax E. Let's listen to this.
Ein Licht tanzt freundlich vor mir her. Ich folg ihm nach die Kreuz und quer. Ich folg ihm gern und seh's ihm an, dass es verlockt den Wandersmann.
The identity of phrase 2 to phrase 1 makes possible a straightforward truncation in the reprise. To compose an abbreviated A prime section, Schubert could simply have deleted one iteration of the repeated material. An A prime section composed in such a manner would also be hypermetrically regular. That Schubert did not choose this solution is clear from the final cadence of A prime, which is identical not to its referential music, the 7th and 8th bars of A, but instead to the final cadence of the A section, its 15th and 16th bars. The deletion, then, is of a portion of the interior of A. This slide gives an image of the deletion in terms of the score as landscape metaphor. A and A prime begin on a single staff because A prime begins by tracking its referential A section. At measure 37, however, the A prime section veers away from the referential path that was laid down for it to follow in bars 12 forward. Starting at measure 37, the A prime section treads a new path, though it be similar in a telling way to the old. For a measure or two, it is unclear where this swerve has taken us, the two C-sharps of Nur Täuschung, being equivalent to the song's phrase-initiating C-sharps, briefly suggest the entry of the next phrase 1 bar early. At measure 39, the intensified cadential formula signals a sudden end of the strophe, not 1, but 5 bars too early. This musical formal distortion is an analogy to, or put more strongly, a presentation of, the physical perceptual illusion faced by the wanderer as he veers from his path to pursue the inviting ignis fatuus. It occurs on the word Täuschung, literally a beguilement, an illusion. The illusion is given not only to the wanderer, but also and equally to us as listeners. Schubert's song performs the sense deception experienced by the musical protagonist who inhabits it. And we as listeners are put in the first-person position of that protagonist. We hear the alteration in the song's deep-level rhythm, even as the ground seems to move beneath his feet. It is whimsical but instructive to take the landscape metaphor literally, as it were, to put ourselves in the protagonist's shoes. Take this slide as a map of the terrain and imagine hiking through it. At measure 37, you suddenly stumble from the expected path onto a new one. The landscape from your new perspective is uncannily familiar. Many of its features are expected, but they appear too close, or too large, or too early. Indeed, the intensified cadence, which a moment ago appeared in the distance, now stands immediately in front of you, only 1 bar away. The musical landscape of Die Nebensonnen is similarly strange, and fittingly so, for it also deals with the theme of visual illusion. Die Nebensonnen, so-called phantom suns, is an atmospheric phenomenon in which the refraction of sunlight through ice crystals gives the impression of 2 additional suns in the sky, one on either side of the real one. Take a moment to scan Müller's text, itself a refractory meditation on loss and the desire for death. And here too, this text was undifferentiated in the original. As in Täuschung, this song's A section consists of 2 iterations of an identical melody, this one in a stately saraband topic. Here, the identical melody appears in 2 distinct harmonic contexts, A major and F sharp minor. The decoupling of melody from harmony is evocative of a corresponding split between the subjective protagonist who sings the song and the objective harmonic conditions that, as it were, surround him. The circularity of the Wanderer's song suggests a strophic sameness, an incantatory obsessiveness, while its changeable harmonic scaffolding suggests a contingency of its appearance on external factors. This description resonates with 2 interpretive categories that have been central to Schubert discourse since Adorno's 1928 essay, Schubert, Lighting and Atmosphere. Schubert's themes, Adorno wrote in that essay, wander, just like he whose beloved abandoned him to winter. Those themes know of no history but only shifts in perspective. The only way they change is through a change of light. This is where to find the origin of the idea of atmosphere. Atmosphere is what changes around things that remain timelessly the same, and this change makes no difference to them. How beautifully this describes Schubert's rendering of Müller's landscape, in which the objective meteorological conditions, an icy atmosphere, an impending blizzard, a sun low on the horizon, have literally given rise to multiple sources of light. This slide paints the A section of Die Nebensonnen in an Adornian light. On it, 2 mock suns illuminate the Wanderer's strophic song from 2 different physical locations, casting 2 different harmonic shadows. The eastern sun casts regular note heads, the western sun casts lozenges. The landscape metaphor suggests a preliminary reading. As the Wanderer sarabands through the multistellar space, he sings his strophic song, as fixed in melodic content as the mock suns in their position on the horizon. And as his physical location changes relative to that of the suns, there is a corresponding change of lighting. Let's listen. Only one iteration of the song appears in A prime, the Wanderer's song. That the melody is intact suggests that an entire strophe has been deleted from the recapitulation. The harmony, however, clarifies that like the reprises of Erste Verlust and Täuschung, this one combines elements of the beginning and the end of the referential A section into a single abbreviated strophe. The quicker transformation from the eastern light of A major to the western light of F sharp minor lends a sense of urgency to A prime. The image would seem to be of the Wanderer picking up the pace as his thoughts grew more desperate. But it is equally possible to read the recapitulatory truncation as registering a change not in the Wanderer's progress through a static landscape, but in the objective conditions of the landscape itself. Remember, the only way that themes change in this universe is through changes of light. As time passes in this penultimate song, the physical sun begins to set, and the titular solar illusions begin to draw inwards towards their source. The harmonic shadows they cast draw closer together until they overlap, such that A major moves to F sharp minor at the midpoint of the strophe. This reading lends weight to Arnold Feil's interpretation of Die Nebensonnen as a representing of the sinking of the traveler of Winterreise, as in a grand exit in a final scene. It also resonates with Adorno's description of the Nebensonnen twilight. The setting of the suns, rendered elegantly by the recapitulatory compression in this penultimate song, is a lowering of the curtain on the weary winter wanderer. It signals a dreary end to the monodrama. So let's listen to this A prime section. As with the novel then, so with music. The disruptions of regular musical breathing, easily identified in forms with recapitulations, acquire a dramatic function by bringing about cadences, thematic onsets, and other musical events too soon. In our Winterreise leader in particular, the accelerations are dramatically appropriate. They embody the swerves and yaws of the wanderer as he traverses his gelid musical landscape. They enact auditorily his own perception and misperception of virtual objects in a visual field. In these songs, and one is tempted to say in all songs, musical form arrogates to itself a dramatic function. It projects, or performs, or stages the dramatic content of the text it sets, even as it brings that text into being. The analyses above are whimsical, of course, but they also testify to the ways in which the form of a song mediates and leavens its textual content, the ways in which it stages dramatically robust manipulations of narrative time and space, the ways in which, ultimately, it undergirds the music and the psychic dramas of song. Thank you very much.
There is certainly a little bit of time for questions. I hope people have comments or questions. If you do, come up to the microphone, please. Anybody?
Thanks, Jonathan. Really, really interesting paper. I'd like to comment not on the music or your analysis so much as the Umberto Eco quote, which I've read that book, but of course I totally forgot that ending. But that's a really beautiful passage, and I think it's really interesting. So what I'd like for you to comment on is this, something that that quotation says, and that you demonstrated in the music, is the whole idea of pacing when something needs to happen, when things need to wind down. You know, so the whole question of pacing is a really interesting one musically. And one thing I've thought for a long time is that in theory, we don't have much to address that. I've not taught much composition, but I've taught a little, and I've heard, you know, composition students talk about their lessons. And I know that one thing that you as a composition teacher are always saying, well, you know, something needs to happen here, or too much is happening here, you know, it needs to be spread out, and so forth. And in our dealing with canonic music, I think that's an interesting point, and as you show, like incredibly important in both the way the song or a piece plays out and the way that we perceive it. So given that as just a takeoff, do you have any comment on that?
Sure, I'd be glad to comment on it. It's a wonderful, thank you so much for that point, Pat. It's a wonderful observation. Here I'm doing a little bit of hedging. I'm making your question a little bit more tractable because I'm dealing with forms that have repeats. Now, to say something in the abstract that something should appear here, or that the sense of rhythm here is a little bit different, is difficult and subjective and intuitive. And I think we all have intuitions about that. It's very difficult, I think, to codify them in any way. But the project becomes much easier and more tractable for me because I'm dealing with repeats, right, or reprises that if only you make this leap, it only takes one leap, which is to say that A prime should be in some sense like A and can be meaningfully compared with A. It's only if you take that leap that what I'm saying becomes kind of easy to get a hold on. Does that make sense? It's obvious that A prime is shorter or longer or something than A. For Eco, it's slightly different. For Eco, he's dealing with prose, and I love that he calls it scansion. I think that that's a wonderful metaphor. So he says the scansion of events. So, I mean, we think of the way a word scans, but we don't think of the way a phrase or a sentence scans. And here Eco's talking about the scansion of entire chapters. So there is heavily dependent on the Greek notion rhythmos, so this recurring motion that's cyclic and periodic. And Eco says once that someone is entrained in the periodic rhythm that you expect to come back, then the author's in control because he can shorten or lengthen or something the events. Yeah, thanks so much.
Other comments? I have one, but I must defer to you. Something from you, Charles.
Yeah. Well, thanks. That was a really interesting paper. I wonder if you'd thought about the fact, actually, of 2 points. The first being that it seemed to me that almost all of these truncations or shortenings or abbreviations have to do with the submediant. And that would seem to be reasonable, since the submedian, after all, can both stand for the tonic but also lead to the dominant. So in some ways, it's the most flexible of harmonies, so it's useful for this kind of thing.
I think absolutely. You know, I hadn't considered it, honestly. I think absolutely useful. It's interesting that I talk so much about deep-level rhythm, that I'm so interested in this notion of rhythmos, but I haven't so much talked about deep-level voice leading, have I? Or deep-level harmony. Yeah, so that's an interesting point.
And the other point is that the two parallel phrases of Die Nebensonnen, they end the same way. The last two measures are the same, so it's almost as if there's a kind of gravitational pull towards the same place, maybe towards the central sun. I don't know, but it's curious that when you merge them, there is no blending that has to happen for the last two measures.
Exactly.
It's only the first part that has to be changed.
I take your point. I think it's a very good one, but also I point out that the part of my point here is to notice that even in seemingly obvious situations, it seems to make more sense, even though it's less economical. It still seems to make more sense to understand these forms as having been deleted. It's a medial portion that's been deleted. So I take as axiomatic almost that the end will be the same. Although your point is well taken.
I am going to butt in and ask a question on a more pragmatic level here. Your paper was so beautifully poetic.
Thank you.
On a more mundane level, maybe the forms of the poems need to be considered. It happens that the two songs from Winterreise are the only two in the entire cycle that are 10 lines, rather than a series of quatrains, 4 plus 4 plus 4, etc. So Schubert actually runs out of words. I mean, that's one of the reasons why he's got to do something. It's one of the reasons why the A prime is going to be shorter, unless he were to repeat. And I would say that, for instance, in Nebenzone, we hear the same phrase twice as an antecedent consequent. If we were to hear it again as an antecedent consequent, it might have been a little too much.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? I mean,
I think thank you so much. That's really important. I think there are two things really going on there. One of them is this question of redundancy or superfluity, and I tend to bristle a little bit at that position. And I'm not exactly sure why, because I level that claim to myself in my own work sometimes. But sometimes I tend to think, why should we assume that? You know, is that historically is it contextual? Is it sensitive enough to assume that things should be cut the later you move in an exposition or the later you move in a musical form? And there's much more to say there, so we should talk about that. As to the first point, here's the issue with that. I take it as a kind of a support of my own project that these texts are undifferentiated. So there's always just a little bit of, it's not uncomfortable or anything, but just a tiny bit of question begging that goes on when you approach a text like this. Because you say, for instance, that he runs out of lines. And I understand what you mean, of course. On the other hand, he made the reprise himself. I mean, the poem was completely undifferentiated, and there was complete formal freedom there. And nevertheless, he chose to write a B section and then come back to an A section at the end. Do you see what I mean? Like, in other words, it depends which element you want to talk about moving and which element you want to talk about as stable. So you could say he ran out of room, so therefore he must. But then on the other hand, we could take another element as stable there.
Right, but in both cases, the text itself invites a repetition or a
Yes.
Because there's a return, if not literally or close to the same line.
Yes.
There's a return to the central idea.
Yeah. Schubert, of course, sensitive to these two poems having a sort of relationship, right? They're both completely undifferentiated, which I think in Müller's telling represents a kind of, how would you put it? It's clipped, it's fast, it's ecstatic, it's difficult. The wanderer no longer has, Susan Ewan says, the power or the strength to divide these into stanzas. They both have the word ach, right, in the middle position, and Schubert decides to set the B section beginning on the word ach, and then to come back. So there are they're both in dance topics and so on. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one really short question. Anybody would like to put a word in? If not, yes, come on up to the mic. Please.
I was wondering if you'd consider looking at a project like this, for example, with Eric Clark's virtual spaces, because I think particularly with that ecological musicology approach and the use of atmosphere and natural conditions, as well as the subjectivity position of where you're looking at in the landscape. So yeah, I was just wondering, have you looked at it through that?
I've not, and actually I'm not aware of that, but I'll write it down and make a note. Yeah, thank you so much.
Let's applaud him.
Thank you all. Will you use my machine? Oh, thank you so much for your question. Let's see. All right, I'll grab this.
I would like to introduce Lawrence Willis now, and to say right away, he has just this week successfully defended his PhD dissertation at McGill University. I think he needs a little round of applause. His dissertation is on formal interplay in ternary piano works of the late 19th century. He's the recent recipient of the Carl Geiringer Fellowship from the American Brahms Society. His article on Ben Johnston's Just Intonation String Quartet No. 9 has been published in Music Theory Online. And he is currently working on a translation of Christian Utz's composition in the context of globalization. We have a title here, Formal Interplay in Ternary Piano Works of Johannes Brahms. Let's please welcome Laurence.
I think there's a little bit of setup to be done. Great, thank you. Hello everyone. In today's paper, I'm going to present a theoretical approach to accounting for the transsectional effects found in Brahms's late ternary piano works. And I'm going to explain through two in-depth analyses. What's going on? Ooh. Yeah? Okay, we're just going to restart, I think. There we go. There we go. So in today's paper, I'm going to present a theoretical approach to accounting for the transsectional effects found in Brahms's late ternary piano works, and I'm going to explain through two in-depth analyses, a pair of paradigms that describe two kinds of ternary composition, the unifying return and the compensatory return. The tripartite nature of ternary form is essential to the arguments I'm going to make, as I hear these works as dialectically constructed, with their sections driving towards a larger synthesis that reveals some kind of relationship between the various parts of the work. Indeed, I hope it will become evident through my talk that unifying returns and compensatory returns in ternary works are really but two sides of the same musical coin, a drive towards clarification, and a subtle exploration of how themes, musical ideas, tonalities, and counterpoint may work together against the divisive role of musical contrast. My research has precedents in the analytical literature, such as Stephen Rings's chapter on Brahms's learned self, Ryan McClellan's Brahms and the Principle of Destabilized Beginnings, and Anne Besser-Scott's thematic transmutation in the music of Brahms. And you can find citations for all of these works in your handout. And each of these essays artfully comment on some of the dynamics that might appear in the intersectional arrangement of Brahms's piano music. But since time presses, let's begin directly with a musical example. The opening of the main theme of Brahms's intermezzo in E major, opus 116, number 6, as shown in example 1 of your handout. And this theme is organized as a small ternary theme type. Let's listen to its first measures, which comprise the small A section, which is arranged as a modulating period. Immediately as the piece begins, an intervening chromatic voice, which I've circled, disturbs the otherwise diatonic setting, and throughout the opening section, such irritant chromatic voices keep appearing, and these chromaticisms lead to the strange modulation in the opening period to C-sharp major. The initial chromatic voice in the basic idea is transferred to the bass of the contrasting idea of the antecedent, and similarly in the consequent, the chromatic voice is transferred from the basic idea of to the contrasting idea, now appearing in a tight canonic formation leading to C sharp, which Brahms then modally shifts to major. To my ear, this unusual tonicization of the major submedian arises as a consequence of that unusual intrusion of the chromatic voice into a diatonic texture. The small ternary B section that follows continues the excursion initially to C sharp major, and let's listen to it unfold and hear what happens. What I want to particularly draw your attention to in this short B section is the sonority that it ends on, and this harmony, which is a dominant sonority harmony, has a couple of ways of being interpreted. Either it can be heard as a common tone enrichment of the 5/7 of 4 that arises just before it, perhaps even suggesting a large thirds division between E major, C sharp major, and A major that fails to appear. Another way is to hear this diminished 7 as an applied diminished 7 of the dominant, a harmony that then fails to properly materialize at the beginning of the small ternary A prime section. For the moment, let's leave this diminished 7th as another unusual diversion which doesn't seem to have an immediate explanation, but is unusual in the context of a small ternary B section. The A prime section of this theme begins directly with the period's contrasting idea, and perhaps the similarity of the opening sonority of this contrasting idea to a dominant 6/4 acts as a kind of explanation for why the basic idea is omitted, as it might be heard to resolve to some extent that weird diminished 7th that I talked about just before. The A prime section is altered significantly compared to the A section. Its consequent phase brings a totally different harmonic setting, starting off with F7, the tritone substitute of the home key, but again flowing into the tight canonic arrangement that we remember from the C sharp major episode. Now, the tight canon takes part in a progression with 3 different dominant sonorities, all related by minor triads. Let's take a listen through to this portion of the theme. Oh, there's the canonic arrangement. Let's listen. So in this little progression that ends this theme, F7 first gives way to D7 in first inversion, before the dominant of E major then appears later and brings an imperfect authentic cadence to E major. All of these dominant 7th sonorities may be heard as related to the same diminished 7th by single semitone perturbations, as modelled by Rick Cohn's Boret spiders or else Dalfet's dancing towers. In this way, despite the weirdness of the progression in terms of local dominant function of each individual chord, we may think of the group of them as providing a kind of enrichment of dominant function to the theme that results in the imperfect authentic cadence. And we might call this a kind of hyperdominant function which resides in the diminished 7th that structures the relationship between the harmonies. So now we have something of a story to tell about the main theme, small ternary. First, chromaticism seems to intervene in an otherwise diatonic setting and results in an unusual tonicization. And taking the same contrapuntal formula as a starting point, i.e. the close canonic figure, the unusual progression at the end of the theme wrestles the chromatic voices away from their potential modulatory function to keep the work in E major. Here, 3 different dominant 7th sonorities, all related to a single diminished 7th, take on the role of an enriched dominant in the context of the theme. The unusual collection of dominants seems to be opposed in the context of the small ternary theme to the diminished 7th at the end of that small B section. And that diminished seventh might be thought of as the dominant to the hyperdominant, a diminished seventh harmony at one point of remove from the diminished seventh that structures the unusual progression at the end of the theme. Let's move on and look at the interior section of the intermezzo, cast in G sharp minor, and we'll see that it's of a wholly different variety to the main theme. It begins with, it brings descending diatonic scales, similar to the top line of the main theme's basic idea, but without the irritant of clashing chromatic lines. The 3 against 2 that we heard actually already in the small ternaries B section returns here in a kind of song with accompaniment-like texture. And I'm not going to talk too much about the vagaries of this interior section, but I would like you to hear its first few measures so you can get a sense of these materials. The return of the main theme begins much as the main theme itself. But now, however, rather than the discontinuous interruption of a C-sharp major episode, Brahms omits that entire excursion in favor of moving directly to that F7 harmony, measure 49, that we might remember from measure 18. And this harmony is greatly rhetorically expanded with beautiful descending arpeggio gestures in parallel thirds, emphasizing the importance of the harmony. And then the harmony goes on to take part in the same tight canonic progression, leading to an imperfect authentic cadence, just like the end of the main theme. Let's take a listen to this part of the return of the main theme, leading to that imperfect authentic cadence. Yet here, I hear the imperfect authentic cadence as much less as satisfactory as an ending than it was as a placeholder ending at the end of the main theme itself. And in the works I've analysed of Brahms's late period, I found that entire compositions really rarely end on an imperfect authentic cadence, but usually observe the need for a perfect authentic cadence to bring true closure. And to my ear, the imperfect authentic cadence here at measure 56 leaves us with unfinished business. But what is this unfinished business? And looking at the next measures, and you have this example on your handout so you can see it perhaps in more detail, we hear a return of the materials of the interior theme, but now, crucially, the chromatic inner voice is integrated into the texture. Here, the chromatic voice harmoniously combines with the descending diatonic voice in direct contradiction to the opening of the basic idea of the main theme. The descending diatonic scale that it works so well with at the end of the music, it goes on to descend all the way from scale degree 8 to scale degree 1, which I've given stemmed in measure 63. And in this way, the integration of the contrasting materials of the work takes part in the ultimate perfect authentic closure of the work as well. And let's listen to this remarkable integration of otherwise contrasting materials. And this kind of synthesis leads me to the paradigm of ternary form that I call a unifying return. First, the music presents a way of doing things, i.e. The juxtaposition of diatonic settings and chromatic irritating voices, and then a new set of materials are proposed, and in this case, which entirely exorcise chromatic voices. And finally, the last section, the two contrasting materials are synthesized to create a higher union of those materials. and therefore we hear what I would call a unifying return. My next analytical example is Brahms's intermezzo in E-flat, Opus 117, number 1, and is going to demonstrate the paradigm, my other paradigm of compensatory return. The initial situation of the main theme is of quite a different type to Brahms's Opus 116, number 6. In each of the 4 measure segments of the work's main theme, we fail to find a root position subdominant harmony. The first 4 measures only bring tonic and dominant harmony, where the next 4 do bring a predominant, but it acts to tonicize 5 rather than as a proper diatonic subdominant harmony. The next 4 measures, again, only bring a chromaticized predominant, and the final 4 measures bring a perfect authentic closure to the tonic with a more fulsome cadential progression, 1-6, 5-7 of 5, 5-7 with a prolonging 6, and finally the tonic. But again, we fail to find any kind of diatonic subdominant harmony taking part in a cadence. Let's listen to the first 4 measures of this theme to get a flavor of these materials. To be sure, the omission of root position subdominant harmony is not usually to be heard as a syntactical musical problem in tonality, but as we shall see, the music that follows in the work's B section highlights the role of the subdominant and brings attention to its initial lack. Immediately after the measures that we see that we've just seen, Brahms dramatically redirects us towards the minor subdominant A flat minor, and it thus becomes clear that the subdominant has some role to play in the piece beyond the main theme. Which I think highlights the subdominant in a particularly striking way at this moment. The B section of Opus 117, number 1, is cast in the parallel tonic minor, and throughout, stability on the minor tonic is assuaged via evasions, tonicizations of the subdominant, and unstable inversions. And though there are many interesting instances of discontinuity in this section, let me just bring your attention to a couple. As shown in example 10 on your handout, in measure 31, a clear diatonic progression to A flat, the work's global subdominant, results in the tonic being replaced by 5-7 of 4, which then transforms into a submediant harmony of that key, only to be followed by a further attempt at the tonic A flat in measure 33, which is now replaced by the 7 diminished 7 of the home key of E flat. Then, at the end of the B section, a strong progression to E flat threatens to bring about tonic closure via the Neapolitan and the dominant, but instead deceptively resolves to 5-7 of 4 in measure 37. And in this way, the whole of the B section is suffused with such tonal instability, and the key to that instability is the subdominant harmony, either as an unfulfilled modulation or as the target of deceptive tonicizations at the moment of closure. And let's listen to just this passage that I have on the screen right now, which ends the B section. Now let's turn to the end of the work, and the return of the main theme is an almost verbatim return of the main theme itself, but with a decorative canonical aberration that's been beautifully described by Stephen Rings. But if we listen now to the very final measures of the work, we can hear one of the most important adjustments that Brahms brings to this theme. Let's listen. So after an artful canonic passage, there's a cadential progression that sounds for all the world like it might have achieved closure around measure 53. And instead, the tonic is dramatically replaced by a root position subdominant harmony, rolled rin sforzando and marked espressivo for emphasis. And not only does this replacement of the tonic with the subdominant bring to the theme the subdominant that was missing in its in the work's A section, but the importance of its appearance is highlighted through the role of the subdominant in the B section. And indeed, the subdominant plays an important role throughout the work. In the A section, as an absence marked by a sudden turn to the minor subdominant in measures 17 to 20. In the B section, as a harmonically disrupting influence. And in the A prime, as a decisive actor in the forceful cadential closure of the theme. And I call such a scheme a compensatory return. The two paradigms of ternary form that I've presented here, the unifying return and the compensatory return, represent the two most important categories in ternary composition in the late 19th century, and I hope to have provided an interpretive framework through which other analytical studies of this repertoire can begin. And on the last page of your handout, I've produced a table showing some representative compositions of each paradigm from Brahms's late piano opuses. There's more detail in that table than just the two paradigms. There are some subsidiary paradigms within unifying returns. And I hope that the analyses that I've just presented may act as stimulation for further analyses that pay similarly close attention to the role of various intersectional effects in ternary forms and the subtle ways that Brahms finds to enliven pieces that deserve a richer description than simply A, B, A. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for your paper.
Hello.
I wondered if we could take a quick look at example 1.
Yes.
So you mentioned that toward the end there, we're sort of on this maybe like wrong dominant, but then if we take a look over on the next page at 15, we're sort of on B in the bass. And I just wondered, had you maybe considered that at the end of that little B section, that in fact this is sort of we're still kind of in predominant function, and that this is a case of maybe sort of a cadential 6/4 arrival that's been sort of collapsed in with.
So to think of that as a cadential 6/4.
Right, the dominant arrives in such a way that it comes with the reprise. There's some early examples of this in, say, the Appassionata, but also this is something that Schumann was fond of. So, for example, Opus 24. Schöne Wiege meines Leiden, it comes to, in a really dramatic B section, sort of a very strong predominant harmony, which then picks up again in 1. And in fact, I wonder, on the last example that you had, sort of that it could be the same thing.
Okay. I'm not going to flick through all the slides, because we'll hear all of it in very quick successions.
But that maybe the sort of more important dominant arrives in 53 as opposed to beat 2 of measure 52.
Okay.
Well,
I think, so to answer both questions, I think this instance where we've had like the 7 diminished 7 of 5, and then we hear a tonic harmony in 6/4 position, which I really think has to be thought of as a tonic harmony because of our contextual understanding of what comes earlier. I think that Brahms is having his cake and eating it.
I agree.
He's saying that I want to be able to resolve this harmony, but he doesn't then go on to treat that as an actual dominant. He treats it like a tonic. So I think he's giving you kind of both. And I think that I hope it came across that my description of the hyperdominant and its relationship to the diminished 7 that comes there. That diminished 7 would be kind of like, in a large functional sense, a predominant to the hyperdominant made of several dominant 7 harmonies. For the other example, I think for sure that the cadential progression that comes after the tonic replacement is the one that closes the work. That's the real final PAC. But I think it's important for us to attend to the fact that there was this kind of, Brahms sets it up as a possibility although with metrical complications, and then does something dramatic to replace it so that he can, I think, give us something that was really missing earlier. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I was wondering sort of which it is sort of ambiguous as to sort of whether it's tonic or dominant. I just wanted you to maybe address that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for a great paper and some very interesting analyses.
Thank you.
I had some ideas that I wanted to kind of throw out at you and see what you do with, because I noticed a lot of things about your examples, in particular about your idea of unifying and compensatory returns. This seems to me to be a feature also of sonata forms in Brahms's style, and usually not in the recapitulation, but in the coda, where these kinds of things can happen. And what I've noticed in some of Brahms's sonata forms is this kind of thing happening in the rhythmic domain specifically, where a lot of different meters are played with in the sonata form proper, and then are all brought together in this kind of unified rhythmic dissonance in the coda. And I noticed something similar about your Opus 17 example. So one thing I want to ask about is the rhythmic aspect of what's going on in this piece, and also about the relationship of how unifying returns can happen in these binary forms that you're looking at, but also in sonata forms. And so what I notice here is that the moment where that subdominant appears, there's also a rhythmic displacement introduced that's not part of the theme, and that rhythmic displacement, I think you could also say comes from the B section of the ternary form. It has a similar rhythmic displacement.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's a good observation. I think that, like, when I said that it sounds for all the world like there's about to be closure there, if one was an attentive metric listener, it kind of can't there. It's happening in the wrong moment. But I still think that it's a salient enough kind of progression for it to give us pause for thought. I'll mention that some of my other examples that I've pulled out of Brahms in these ternary forms have metric regularizations at the end of their works. So the large opening work of Opus 116, so number 1, brings what I hear many hypermetric displacements going on in the main theme that are then also found in the middle section. I hear it as a ternary, by the way, not as a sonata form. And then in the last return of the main theme, everything's regularized so that it can be exactly 16 measures long, and everything can kind of stand in the 4x4 that it was kind of sounded like it kind of should have done in the initial instance. I've also found instances of very similar things in 4A, where some simple meter will, something in simple meter will be recast into compound meter at the end because the B section was in a compound meter. So it's a way of unifying those two materials is to take the kind of mold of the B section rhythmically and apply it to the opening section. I have thought about sonata form, but it's wasn't quite what I was talking about. But yes, I understand those points. Yeah. Thanks.
Laurence, I would like to ask the audience if there's anybody else other than me who might think that there are only 2 dominant 7th chords in the unusual progression.
Oh, this one here doesn't come as a dominant 7.
No, the one before that, starting on the G in the bass. Is there a chance that could actually be heard as a tonic with a passing chord in the left hand, in the right hand?
Oh, this one here. Which one?
That one right there.
Yeah. So that I wasn't.
Anybody?
No, I wasn't saying that was a dominant 7th sonority.
Where are your 3 then?
So the third one would be the dominant of the home key. Would be a
I see. Okay,
dominant
but
7th.
Not 7th.
It's not a 7th in this instance, but it's been heard as a 7th earlier. Yeah,
Right.
in other instances.
I'd like to ask you about this afterwards, but
Sure.
I guess we have to move on. One last teeny question. Okay, make it really short.
Yeah. At the risk of embarrassing myself, because I don't know the secondary literature, I'm wondering if you thought of a pastoral topic as something to accompany your second reading. It seems to me that it works really well with kind of how the subdominant is being repressed and coming back. It also works well with the topics. It also works well with the sort of ending and the rhythmic sort of release, which is then being recontained with that subdominant. So I just thought you might have some comments on that. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the the main theme's harmony in Opus 117, number 1. Part of the reason why I think there's that kind of omission is because the harmony, especially in the first 4 measures, is really as simple as it could possibly be. And I think that reflects that lullaby-ish pastoral type topic. And then Brahms tries to do something with that. And that's where my analysis kind of springs from. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure now to introduce Kelvin Lee, who is currently at the final stage of his PhD in music theory and analysis at Durham University, where he's completing a dissertation on analysis and history of symphonic music in the long 19th century, and on tonal harmonic implications on formal syntax in fin de siècle Vienna symphonic music. He's the chair of the Society for Music Analysis, SMA, that group called the Formal Theory Study Group, and he's the recipient of the SMA's Theory and Analysis Graduate Student Prize in 2018. And news bulletin just came in, what, this morning?
yeah, like before I came to this.
Okay. He has an article on Mahler, which has just been accepted by Music Analysis. Let's welcome Kelvin.
Thanks, Janet. Well, it's fine, it's fine. I will just navigate. Yep. So, I begin by revisiting the definitions of 2 symbols that are commonly used today to describe 19th century form functional practices. The first one, a white word double arrow, represents Janet Schmalfeldt's seminal formulation of form functional becoming, which she refers to as, quote, the special case whereby the formal function initially suggested by musical idea, phrase, or section invites retrospective reinterpretation within the larger formal context. The second one, a left-right double arrow, denotes form functional oscillation, which Nathan Martin and Stephen van den Mortelle recently theorized as a situation that is, quote, internally dynamic, one that bounces back and forth between conflicting form functional profiles, but that in the larger scheme is entirely static. During their formulation, these 2 authors also allude to a third symbol, a leftward double arrow, which they intend as a substitution for the rightward double arrow to indicate the syntactic regression of form functional profile. Despite the reversal of direction, this understanding of the leftward double arrow, however, manifests the same dialectical process as its rightward counterpart, where the original formal function is displaced by the later one. It therefore risks obscuring a different dialectical situation and form functional scenario inherent in the notion of regression, in which the entire formal unit displays a form functional conflict that regresses to its initial profile at a higher formal hierarchical level, a case that is especially pertinent to what van den Mortelle terms 2-dimensional sonata form. Mindful of the dialectical bearing of form functional transformation, this paper reappraises the current accounts of form functional becoming and oscillation in explicitly dialectical terms. And from there, I posit regression as a distinct form functional scenario pertinent to Martin Heidegger's ontology, a relation demonstrated via an analysis of Richard Strauss' Alpensinfonie. I argue that while becoming and oscillation display respectively, an Adornian negative dialectic and a Hegelian dialectic, regression otherwise exhibits a local form functional becoming or oscillation that is retrospectively reinterpreted as reversing to its original profile at an overarching level in 2-dimensional sonata form, and this attests to Heidegger's existential analytic of Dasein. Such a situation is exemplified through Eine in der Welt, where the advent of a PAC forces regression and exposes the epistemological precedent of the subject. This formulation consequently leads to a taxonomy of form functional transformation, which I contend is foundational to the elucidation of form functional practices in the long 19th century. Schmalfeldt's conception of becoming is based on the idea of form coming into being, which she derives from Karl Dachau's dialectical account of the Tempest Sonata. Citing Dachau's remarks that the beginning of the movement is not yet the subject, the evolutionary episode is one no longer. Schmalfeldt argues that the form-functional ambiguity engendered by the non-congruence between formal parameters in measure 1 to 21 manifests a Hegelian process of becoming. The formal unit exhibits a complete middle ground harmonic contrapuntal structure that supports what could be considered as an expanded periodic main theme. Yet its allusion to the sensibility topic, suggested by the fluctuating emotional intensity and rapid change of affect, evokes the image of an introduction that functions in a similar way as an accompanied recitative. This experience of form-functional conflict between introduction and main theme thus invites us to hear music in time, through which we can discern a process of introduction becoming main theme. Schmalfeldt, however, warns us that this expression does not favor the main theme function over the introduction function, since the term becoming, quote, strives to accentuate the process rather than the result of Beethoven's opening passage. Becoming unites the concept and its apparent opposite, in this case, introduction and main theme. Such an emphasis on the process signifies a dialectical situation where neither of the form-functional profiles asserts dominance within a given form-functional time. In the current case, the sensibility topic is integrated into the production of the main theme, which is not ratified until the elide PAC in measure 21 that marks the end of the formal unit. The functionality of the recitative-like introduction is thereby confronted with the main theme coming into being throughout the entire formal span. In other words, the interthematic unit's identity as an introduction is predicated on the tremendously expanded yet harmonically stable periodic design that paradoxically implies a main theme. To put it in Hegelian terms, the introduction function can only be grasped through its opposition to the main theme function. And their synthesis generates the condition of becoming that informs our experience of the formal span. Or to paraphrase Hegel, the formal unit is not yet in its beginning, but the beginning is not merely the introduction. On the contrary, the main theme is already there, too. The beginning itself is also becoming, but it expresses already the reference to further progression. This understanding posits becoming as both the process and the result, a description which corresponds to Martinez and Morteller's account of form-functional oscillation, for it suggests a scenario that is, quote, again, internally dynamic, but that in the larger scheme is entirely static. Schmalfeldt's notion of becoming, hence, I would argue, resonates with form-functional oscillation, and it is perhaps better represented by the left-right double arrow, since the expression becoming is meant to indicate that, quote, what has become preserves our memory of the original conflict, end quote. If what Schmalfeldt intended for becoming accords with what Martin and van der Morteller theorized as oscillation, what then does the right double arrow connote? Martin and van der Morteller make the distinction between two heterogeneous instances of form-functional transformation and proclaim that the right-verse double arrow designates a situation in which, quote, each function comes before a different moment in the unit, one at the beginning and one at the end. While both functions might in retrospect be said to overlap at the beginning, the end expresses only the second function. Although the initial expression is not forgotten, the second function ultimately prevails without any residual ambiguity. This form-functional reinterpretation, as I conceive it, shows a dialectical process that foregrounds the object, or the second function, as the epistemological priority, which in turn attached to Adorno's concept of negative dialectics. While Hegel focused on the speculative synthesis posited by dialectics, Adorno contended that such an identity of the universal has occurred negatively at the expense of particularity. He argued instead that dialectics is the consistent sense of non-identity between the particular and the universal. While Adorno attained to spotlight the non-identical particular, his conception of the particular is paradoxically characterized by the totalizing logic of non-identity. This epistemological shift from identity to non-identity as the truth of dialectics consequently leads to Adorno's prioritization of the object. He subjected idealist philosophy to critique for its affirmation of identity between subject and object, and consequently for its priority of subject as the epistemic basis. Considering that an object's nature is always something other than the subject, Adorno declared that the epistemic subject is objectively constructed by society without which it could not exist. The object, therefore, quote, takes precedence, though it does not cut off the subject-object dialectics, end quote. Such a formulation tallies with the dialectical process inherent in form-functional reinterpretation. The formal unit first elicits an initial function, or the subject, which is then challenged by the second function, or the object. They form a dialectical relationship, and the second function takes precedence at the end, evincing an epistemological shift from the subject to the object, although the memory of the dialectics is retained. With this understanding, Schmalfeldt's idea of retrospective reinterpretation might imply a negative dialectical scenario instead, and the prioritization of the second function is what the rightward double arrow would capture. In their discussion of form-functional reinterpretation in Schubert's string quintet, Martin and van der Mortelle point to the idea that the leftward double arrow and the rightward double arrow express the same dialectical process. Their usage suggests that the difference between the two lies in syntax, in which the leftward double arrow stands for syntactic reversal, rather than progression that the rightward double arrow otherwise indicates. It is then perhaps more appropriate to say closing group reverses to subordinate theme, rather than closing group becomes subordinate theme. Yes, what the leftward double arrow implies is not merely a change of direction, but a completely different dialectical situation. While the rightward double arrow suggests a two-step process that begins with one function and ends with another, the leftward double arrow represents a three-step process, where the initial function and the second function are brought into dialectical or negative dialectical process, engendering an oscillation or a reinterpretation that is reconceived as regressing to its original profile at the end. In other words, the formal unit initially projects a progression and ends up with a regression. This phenomenon is pertinent especially to two-dimensional sonata form, since form-functional transformation in the local sonata form is often reconceived as exhibiting the form-functional profile of an earlier state in the overarching sonata form. This emphasis on the subject as the totalizing profile of form-functional dialectics could be understood in relation to Heidegger's ontology of being. Seeking to revive the question of being that has today been forgotten, Heidegger introduced the notion of design or their being, which he conceived as a distinctive kind of condition of human beings. He asserted that, quote, design is ontically distinguished by the fact that in its very being, that being is an issue for it, end quote, and argued that an investigation of design's mode of engagement with other entities, or what he called an existential analytic of design, would be a step forward to revealing an underlying meaning of being. At the risk of oversimplification, Heidegger's ontological thinking is summarized as follows, with his neologisms being replaced by the commonly used idioms of subject and object in order to retain the consistency of language for comparison. So here we go. The design has no conscious experience of entities as independent objects, but collectively as an ongoing task. It is not until the task is interrupted by malfunctioning or indifferent entities that design becomes conscious and assumes the role of the subject, which sets out to explain the objective encounter. Since the malfunctioning or indifferent entities are not fully fledged objects, design therefore emerged as a problem solver to restore functionality of the entities as a whole. Conceiving form-functional regression through this perspective, the form-functional dialectics is concealed until the ongoing function is interrupted by the intermaking entities that suggest conflicting profiles. A new understanding thereby emerges, and the formal unit is reconceived as manifesting two formal functions, whereby the second function is defective, which allows the recovery of the first function's functionality as the totality of these entities. In other words, although the formal unit exhibits form-functional reinterpretation or oscillation locally, it ratifies the institution of the initial formal function at a higher formal level. This situation is clearly manifest in Eine in den Wald from the Alpensinfonie. The Alpensinfonie displays a special kind of two-dimensional sonata form, where the activation of the formal dimension coincides with the collapse of the cyclic dimension at the advance of the submit, as shown in Table 1 in your handout. The passage that evokes form-functional progression in the second is the second formal unit of Eine in the Wald in A flat major, which I marked in the table with a black box, as you can see here. The score is also given as example 2 in your handout. And let us first have a listen. Okay, this formal unit is situated in the first movement exposition after what I call a subordinate theme function locum tenens or a ST substitution being reinterpreted as a transition, just above where we would expect a subordinate theme as indicated by the preceding MC. Similar to the opening of the Tempest Sonata, the A-flat major unit manifests a monumental hybrid thematic design with a sentential antecedent and a tremendously expanded continuation, or a small ternary ABA prime, if you like. The antecedent opens with a abridged presentation phrase reintroducing the main theme's basic idea, A, followed by a continuation phrase with new materials, B, positing the unit as the subordinate theme of a monothematic exposition, while a wrong key G minor PAC is deployed to delineate the end of the antecedent. B is nevertheless mobilized as the model for the subsequent sequences that strike to establish as a separate theme. Such an opportunity emerges with what might be considered as a prolongational closure, as William Cappin terms it. This closure gesture could be seen as marking of the overall hybrid's continuation phrase, and the sequential materials in the following formal span can then be conceived as a new sentence through which B might develop into a theme. Yet the immediate return of A suggests that B remains a theme in the making. This propounds A and B as distinct materials that elicit separate functions, giving rise to the reconsideration of the entire formal unit as a form-functional oscillation between a main theme, which is evoked by A, and subordinate theme, which is expressed by B. Such a dialectic has been instituted from the very beginning of the unit, whereby the singing viola part could be regarded as a B prefiguration that contrasts A basic idea. The oscillation between main theme and subordinate theme function extends across the entire formal unit, and we eventually come to realize that the subordinate theme function turns out to be another locum tenens or substitution, wherein the unit's home key PAC is achieved at the end. The ostensible prolongational closure does not cease the sequential process, and the pseudo-thematic sequences in turn support the production of an tremendously enlarged continuation phrase rather than a new theme. Hence, at a local level, the formal unit exhibits a form-functional oscillation between main theme and subordinate theme, though the latter's functionality is undercut. Whereas at an overarching level, it expresses yet another main theme function. So whereas at an overarching level, it expresses yet another main theme function, predicate on the initial main theme's basic idea, offering a glimpse of the formal function before it is fully enacted. This attests to a scenario of form-functional regression, which results in a kind of Nietzschean monism that informs both the form and the content of the Alpensinfonie as a whole. To quickly sum up, I contend that each of the double arrows represents a different dialectical, or for a better word, ontological understanding of formal unit, and thereby a different form-functional situation. The left-right double arrow indicates a Hegelian dialectic, which elicits form-functional oscillation, whereby the entire session expresses two conflicting functions. The rightwards double arrow denotes a negative dialectic, evoking form-functional reinterpretation, in which the initial function is gradually eclipsed by or retrospectively reinterpreted as the second function. And the leftwards double arrow manifests Heidegger's existential analytic of Dasein, inducing form-functional regression, which sees a local form-functional oscillation or reinterpretation that embraces a defective second function, being reconceived as regressing to its initial function at an overarching level. At the risk of oversimplification, through delving into the philosophical background that underlies form-functional transformation, I hope to have clarified to a certain extent the meaning of these symbols and distinguished regression as a different species of form-functional scenario that deserves its own formulation. Thank you.
Since we were both featured in this paper, is Nathan here as well? Give you a chance to say something.
Did I understand you correctly?
Well, actually, no. In my case, just one little adjustment that I'd like to make.
All right.
The negative subject becomes object, and object is the goal of the process. That's Stephen and Nathan. That's not me. That would, my view, as you very beautifully expressed earlier, is different. So I'm not of the three possibilities. I wasn't the reinterpretation. That's Stephen and
Yep.
Anyway, small point.
All right.
Other comments or questions, please. Go for it.
Jonathan?
Thanks so much. I learned a lot, and I'm still sort of struggling to piece it together. So I'm going to ask kind of an inchoate question. It just strikes me at first blush that Adorno and Heidegger make strange bedfellows. Not least because Adorno was just so intensely critical of Heidegger. And I can't summarize exactly why Adorno was so critical of Heidegger, first of all, because it's difficult, and second of all, because it's been a while. But it strikes me that the most important thing here is that Heidegger's ontic category of being, the capital B being, has no history. So for Adorno, right, Adorno is going to criticize Heidegger for being ahistorical, where the dialectic is always imbued already with history in a way. And Heidegger's categories are themselves ahistorical abstractions. And so I can't tell right now if the final diagram there that looks like Argyle is fair, and if the subject and the object sort of are interconstituted or co-constituted in that way, at least in my reading of Heidegger. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I would say, like, because I need to basically put it there as subject and object in order for easy understanding. You know how hard it is to understand Heidegger's language. So that's why I put it as like subject and object. But I agree with you that like Heidegger's model is like ahistorical, like essentially. So as to how this can be tied to the Alpensinfonie in particular, well, I would do it via Nietzsche. Yep. So I think like essentially what Adorno's criticism of Heidegger is kind of makes sense to me in the sense that like there's no goal in this thing. In the Alpensinfonie, I mean, like it's just a loop that like they are alluding to. So like that's Nietzsche's idea, and that's Heidegger's understanding of being essentially as well to me. Yep.
Thank you.
Other comments, please. Yes or no? Yep, you're coming. Good.
Hi, Nathan.
Hello. Thank you very much. I have to admit I'm quite out of my depth in a lot of these areas. So there's a lot that I just can't. I'm not equipped to respond to. But and this question might betray some ignorance. Is form functional time the same as well? How is it similar to musical time, and how is it similar to interpretive time, the time in which we're making interpretive decisions about things that we've heard or are hearing, and to what extent in any of those domains of time, when I'm thinking particularly of the middle arrow, the becoming arrow, to what extent when we have made when we've made a reinterpretation, to what extent does memory of the original thought remain active?
Okay. Speaking of form functional time, I think it's similar to interpretive time that you propose. Well, the reason why I term it as form functional is like within a formal function, so that's why it's form functional time. And to what extent the memory actually retained? I think in all cases the memory actually retained. So that's why that's actually Johannes' original idea as well. Like how like we interpret something in the middle of like let's say a session. We actually have the memory of the original interpretation that we had. So that's why I try to make it as if like this is time, and then like afterwards we have like this overarching interpretation of the entire unit. But whereas like within this overarching interpretation, there's like subject and object, like that kind of dialectical understanding within it as well. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
It did. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead. Last question, make it really great.
Whoa.
No pressure.
Kind of building on Jonathan's point about Adorno and Heidegger being strange bedfellows. In your overall analysis, I think the moment that convinces me most is where you put Augenblick. I think that's a really important insight for this piece. That there's a moment where your whole perspective changes.
Yeah.
So if we want to do this with either Adorno or Heidegger, and say we opt for Adorno because we need him for other things, how useful or how meaningful would it be to, instead of Augenblick, say breakthrough?
So you are talking about the difference between the two, or
could you do how much mileage could you get out of the concept of breakthrough here? How far
well,
would you get?
I think breakthrough is a syntactic concept to me. So like that's actually what I've been working on as well. To me, breakthrough denotes a kind of, it's a moment, it's a locus of syntactic reappraisal. So that's why I kind of did a bit modification to your model of two-dimensional sonata form, because I don't think that at the very beginning, at least in this piece, we actually perceive like these two dimensions. It's always in the dimension of cycle. And then we kind of, like, as we pose it, we realize that this is perhaps a bit too much, and we have to kind of like reinterpret, but we don't know how. It's only at the moment of Augenblick or breakthrough that we have this kind of structural reorientation, that we understand this entire piece as a gigantic exposition. And that's also like programmatically, so to speak. This is also like the moment where man thinks, human, not man, human. Yeah, human thinks that like he or she conquered the nature. But this is not the case, since this is just the secondary theme or subordinate theme or whatsoever. And afterwards, we still have a storm to come in the development. Yeah?
Thank you so much,
Thank
Kelvin.
you.
And let's give an applause for all three of our speakers. It's been such a fine series. Thank you.
Hi, how are you? Well, how are you? I'm all right. Good. Let's see what our gizmos are. What do you got? Should be a speaker cord.
Do we have this? I don't have an HDMI connector. I need a mini display port.
Yeah, let me go grab a adapter. The cable's right there. The one that's in here is not working. Okay, so this is the correct one. That's the correct one. And now we've got 1/8-inch audio.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Great.
All right, good. Mini display port. I finally remember what the thing's called. I kept calling it component.
It's fine. It's just fine. Yeah.
Steve.
Steve's first.
And does he have his own? No, actually, no. He told me.
Hello. How are you? Good. It's so great to see you.
Yeah, it's been a while. Yes, this is the most low-tech talk I've ever given.
That's fantastic.
I have handouts. I have audio examples on my computer. I have no
perfect.
PowerPoint.
Isn't that liberating when it happens? No, seriously. Yeah, I used to always do that, and then I started to feel like a dinosaur, so I updated. And now it's liberating sometimes. You know what? I'm going to talk. There's a handout.
Yeah.
Let's listen to some music. Here we go.
And I was actually planning, as I was writing it, I was kind of planning to put stuff on slides, and I kind of caused the end of it with it always being one that handout. I don't need a PowerPoint presentation for that.
You don't necessarily need it all the time. We sort of come to expect it. Yeah. That's a darn good question. Let's see if we can find whoever is helping with this particular. And we're doing there's an 1/8-inch audio, so that's simple enough. Hey, we're gonna have a good turnout for this thing. Oh, you should be fine.
40 and then 5 of the big ones.
You'll be oh great. You first, right? Yeah. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for being here for our graveyard shift session on We've outlasted everybody else at the conference, and I think we should feel very good about that. Give ourselves a pat on the back about that. We've got 3 great talks. We're going to have a lot of Rachmaninoff, some form, some cadences, some counterpoint. Let me introduce our first speaker. Stephen Gosden received his PhD from Yale University in 2012 and now teaches music theory at the University of North Florida. His research interests include the study of form and harmony in 19th and 20th century music, the study of musical intertextuality, and the music of Rachmaninoff. He recently published several resources on teaching rhythm and meter and minor scales on the website of the Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy. His talk today, Rotational Form in 3 of Rachmaninoff's Études-tableaux, Opus 33. Please welcome Steve.
So this is the most low-tech talk I've ever given. There's no PowerPoint. There's just a handout, some audio examples, and my paper here. But there is a handout, so please make sure that you have that. The concept of rotational form that James Hepekoski, Warren Darcy, and others have developed over the past 25 years is among the central concepts in what has come to be known as the new Formenlehre. The core premise of rotational theory is that a substantial amount of Western music is structured by the cyclical recurrence of an ordered series of motivic and thematic ideas. As Hepekoski and Darcy argue, rotational form is a quote-unquote archetypal principle of musical structure that underpins a wide range of distinct formal models, such as rondos, theme and variations, and sonata form, if you haven't heard. Because of its archetypal status in Hepekoski and Darcy's work, rotational form as a theoretical construct is not inherently constrained in its stylistic and historical applicability. There are, however, 2 significant and closely related trends in the writings of Hepekoski, Darcy, and others that exemplify how rotational form, as a compositional technique, has played an important role in both specific works and the overall stylistic development of numerous 19th and 20th century composers. The first is the exploration of how the cyclical organization of a composition's thematic ideas may intersect with or problematize other aspects of its formal design that are not overtly rotational in nature. For example, the use of contrasting middle sections or the demarcation of formal boundaries based on harmonic or other non-thematic criteria. 3 articles that exemplify this trend especially well are Hepekoski's 2010 analysis of Debussy's Nuages, Seth Monahan's 2014 analysis of Mahler's first Kindertotenlied, and Charity Lofthouse's 2016 article on Shostakovich's symphonic sonata forms. In the first, Hepekoski seeks to demonstrate the quote-unquote coexistence of rotational form with the more obvious A-B-A prime structure of Debussy's Nocturne. Along the same lines, Monahan seeks to show how the quote apparent A-A-B-A form of Mahler's song masks a remarkably sophisticated rotational design, unquote. Lofthouse, meanwhile, expands upon Hepekoski and Darcy's concept of sonata deformation by arguing that in 20th century symphonic movements, quote, a sonata's rotational, tonal, and thematic trajectories could be placed in dialogue with each other as separate but complementary, at times even competing, formal processes that shift formal demarcation from the harmonic to the thematic realm, end quote. The second trend, again one that is closely related to the first, has been to use Hepekoski and Darcy's theoretical framework to demonstrate how rotational form has served as an explicit compositional procedure through which 19th and 20th century composers have sought to transcend or subvert the conventionality of existing formal models, without abandoning them altogether. The 3 articles I mentioned regarding the first trend all exemplify this second trend as well, as do Hepekoski's 1993 monograph on Sibelius's Fifth Symphony, Darcy's 1997 article on Bruckner's sonata deformations, and Samuel Nye's 2011 article on the piano music of Fanny Hensel. Nye, in fact, makes this particular aspect of rotational theory the crux of his essay, quote, formal expansiveness and divergence from traditional prototypes in Hensel's music are motivated by a marked emphasis on the rotational principle, unquote. It is in the context of these two trends in the literature on rotational form that I turn now to the music of Rachmaninoff. As several of scholars have observed, the music Rachmaninoff composed from about 1910 onward reflects an increasingly complex and individualized approach to musical form. Blair Johnston, for example, in his dissertation on Rachmaninoff's later music, lists 8 features of the composer's post-1909 output that are especially characteristic of his later style. The last of which is the following, quote, increasing problematization of core formal strategies, especially the departure-return principle and conventional tonal structures with which it is associated, unquote. Along similar lines, Charles Fisk observes a quote-unquote marked stylistic evolution in Rachmaninoff's music. He adds that, quote, even a cursory examination of his best-known pieces for solo piano, the Preludes and Études-tableaux, show this evolution quite clearly, unquote. Fisk then draws a sharp dividing line between Rachmaninoff's first set of preludes, Opus 23 of 1903, and his second set, Opus 32 of 1910, declaring that in marked contrast to the preludes of the first set, those of the second set are quote-unquote almost completely through-composed. The dividing line that Fisk draws between Rachmaninoff's pre- and post-1909 piano works is, with regard to their formal organization at least, almost as clear-cut as he makes it out to be. With few exceptions, the Opus 23 preludes exhibit quite straightforward ternary or rounded binary structures. This is not to say these compositions are lacking in formal creativity. Rather, what I mean here is that, to a very large extent, the harmonic, thematic, cadential, rhetorical, and other dimensions of these compositions are coordinated in such a way as to make each work's formal design relatively unambiguous and easy to discern. In other words, to assert that one of these pieces is in ternary or rounded binary form is to make a fairly comprehensive statement about its formal design. By contrast, for works such as the Opus 32 preludes or the Études-tableaux, Opus 33 and Opus 39 of 1911 and 1916, to assert that a given piece exhibits a simple and conventional formal schema can feel much less satisfactory as an explanation of its inherent formal logic. In some cases, this is because the work really does have such a strong impression of being, as Fisk describes it, through-composed, that any single division of the work into individuated sections can seem uncomfortably tenuous. More often, however, these works do in fact manifest simple and recognizable formal models, but in ways that suggest the formal patterns are, to borrow Lofthouse's quote from earlier, in dialogue with separate but complementary or even competing formal processes. The 3 works that I will be looking at for the remainder of this presentation, the Études-tableaux, Opus 33, numbers 5, 8, and 9. I just want to mention that the numbering for the Études-tableaux is kind of problematic because of how they were published, and I am using Rachmaninoff's original numbering before he dropped one of them and added it to the later set, and before 2 didn't get published but then got published later on. So, long story short, I'm talking about Opus 33 number 5. Simon will be talking about Opus 33 number 4. We're discussing the same piece. So, the 3 works I'll be discussing are all examples of this latter situation. As I plan to show, each etude is structured around a familiar 3-part formal pattern. Strophic form in the case of Opus 33 number 5, ternary form in the case of Opus 33 number 8, and bar form in the case of Opus 33 number 9. In each case, however, the etude's 3-part structure coexists with a rotational structure in the deployment of its motivic and thematic ideas. In this regard, my approach to the formal design of these works has been especially influenced by the first of the 2 trends in rotational theory that I discussed earlier. At the same time, my larger objective in this presentation is to expand our understanding of Rachmaninoff's increasingly imaginative approach to conventional formal models in his post-1910 output. In other words, to build upon the second trend second trend I discussed earlier. Let us turn then to the first etude we will be looking at, Opus 33, number 5, in D minor. As shown in figure 1 on your handout, the three-part strophic design of this work is largely coextensive with its rotational thematic layout. Each strophe and rotation are structured around a basic trajectory from the etude's principal march-like theme, shown in figure 2, through a gradual, stepwise melodic ascent, to a falling gesture, shown in figure 3a, that is based on what I'm calling a spotlight motive. Because of this basic overlap between, on the one hand, the division of the etude into 3 sections, where the last 2 are understood as varied iterations of the first, and, on the other hand, the cyclical deployment of the etude's motivic and thematic ideas, this work, of the 3 I'll be looking at, exhibits the least amount of tension between its outward 3-part structure and its rotational design. There are, nevertheless, 2 essential features of its formal logic that are captured especially well by rotational theory. The first has to do with my use of the term spotlight motive to describe the falling gesture at the end of each rotation. I'm borrowing this term from Darcy's 2001 article on the slow movement of Mahler's 6th Symphony, in particular, its association with Hebekoski's concept of teleological genesis, in which a large-scale structural goal, or telos, near the end of a rotational work is progressively generated by the unfolding of that work's cyclic thematic processes. The term spotlight motive, as Darcy uses it, denotes a kind of motivic thematic catalyst within such a large-scale trajectory. Returning to figure 3a, we can see that during its initial appearance at the end of rotation 1, the spotlight motive is buried as an inner voice. When it returns at the end of rotation 2, as shown in figure 3b, it is still somewhat buried, but in a thicker texture with a louder dynamic suggesting a long-range climactic buildup. And to be clear, I have used the smaller note heads for the surrounding texture, and then the regular note heads show the specific falling gesture and the spotlight motive. When it returns for a third time at the end of the final rotation, as shown in figure 3c, it is in the top voice as the registral climax of the entire piece. The structural significance of this long-range motivic thematic process is therefore something specifically captured by focusing on the work's rotational design. Let's listen to figures 3a, b, and c so we can hear this process unfold. All right, so here's figure 3a. And now figure 3b. And figure 3c. The other essential feature of this work's formal logic that we observe when we focus on its rotational design is the recurrence of a bell-like motto at different points in its successive rotations. As shown in figure 4a, this motto first appears at the outset of the work as a gesture of initiation. Let's listen. It next appears, as shown in figure 4b, as a gesture of conclusion at the end of rotation 1, but one that leads directly into the march-like theme of rotation 2, blurring the boundary between the etude's first and second strophes. Again, let's listen. This is example 4b. As if to highlight the functional ambiguity of this gesture, it returns for a third time in the middle of rotation 2 before making its final appearance, shown in figure 4c, at the end of rotation 3, now as a clear gesture of conclusion. So we'll listen to that. Returning to figure 1, we can trace the trajectory of this motto across the work from gesture of initiation to gesture of conclusion. In doing so, we see a fundamental principle of rotational form at play, the arbitrariness of distinguishing between beginnings and endings that emerges from its inherent circularity. Turning to Opus 33, number 8 in G minor, we can see this principle taken a step further. As shown in figure 5, this work has an A-B-A' structure. At the same time, it exhibits a 7-part rotational design based on 3 distinct gestures derived from a single motive, which I have labeled S for statement, R for response, and C for cadence, with regular Cs indicating PACs and C primes indicating half cadences. Central to my interpretation of this work's rotational organization is the sense of formal function I hear in each of these gestures, S being a gesture of initiation, R a gesture of intermediacy, and C a gesture of conclusion. As figure 5 makes clear, the first 2 rotations are incomplete, both beginning, as it were, mid-cycle. It's not until rotations 3 and 4 that we hear complete cycles through the work's 3 principal gestures. The result of this reverse buildup of the work's referential thematic layout is a sense of form-functional ambiguity for C. As the opening thematic gesture of the work, it is imbued with a sense of beginning. But as the work's rotational design unfolds, its inherent status as a gesture of conclusion comes to the fore. Let's listen to the first 3 rotations so we can hear the unfolding of this process. So this is from figure 5. With the formal functions of S, R, and C ultimately established by rotations 3 and 4, a sense of functional ambiguity persists throughout the remainder of the work. As figure 5 shows, the B section of the Etudes ternary structure is embedded within its 5th rotation. As a result, the C prime gesture in measures 33 to 35 may be understood in 2 ways. As the half cadence that concludes the B section, it suggests an overt rhyme with a half cadence at the end of A in measures 17 to 18. At the same time, when combined with the R and C gestures of rotation 6, a parallel to the C-R-C pattern of rotations 1 and 2 arises, attenuating the boundary between B and A prime. But perhaps the clearest manifestation of functional ambiguity in this work's rotational design comes from its first and last rotations. Whereas the first is based exclusively on C, a gesture of conclusion, the last is the only rotation to exclude C altogether, emphasizing S, a gesture of initiation, instead. Again, as with Opus 33, number 5, the emergent arbitrariness of beginnings and endings in the cyclicality of rotational form is an essential feature of this work's formal logic. The last etude I'll be looking at, Opus 33, number 9 in C-sharp minor, like the first two, divides into 3 sections. In this case, as shown in figure 6, these 3 sections conform to an A', B structure, or bar form. As was the case in Opus 33, number 5, this 3-part structure is basically coextensive with a 3-part rotational design. Indeed, compared to that work in Opus 33, number 8, the ambiguity of beginnings and endings is a much less significant dimension of this work's formal organization. What is significant is the way the surface-level contrast of the B section is underpinned by the same motivic thematic trajectory as the 2 A sections. Specifically, all 3 sections proceed from a distinct baseline motive, labeled X in figure 6, to a thundering motivic thematic gesture of conclusion, labeled Y in figure 6, that helps to articulate a large-scale 1-5-1 harmonic progression. As figure 6 makes clear, there is a measure-for-measure correspondence between A and A' in terms of this motivic thematic layout, but with a 3-measure interpolation between X and Y and A'. Meanwhile, as one would expect, the correspondence between A and B is more subtle. What is especially important to note here is the way measures 3 and 4, the last 2 measures of X, together with measures 5 to 7, the motivic thematic gesture Y, serve as the framework for most of the B section. We can see this in part from the correspondence measures in figure 6, with measures 27 to 29 being an expansion of measures 3 to 4, and measures 40 to 42 corresponding directly to measures 5 to 7. But the motivic thematic relationship between A and B goes further. Let's listen to measures 3 to 7, which are shown in figure 7A. Let's now listen to measures 27 to 30, which are shown in figure 7B. As you'll hear, the 3-note baseline descent of measures 3 and 4, E, D sharp, C sharp, is clearly present. At the same time, you'll hear how the 16th note figuration in the left hand of measures 27 to 28 develops in measures 29 to 30 into the 16th note figuration of Y. This Y-based figuration persists for the rest of the B section until, as shown in figure 7C, there is a wholesale return of Y in measures 40 to 42. In short, the trajectory of X to Y that was established in A and reinforced in A' is an essential feature of B2, despite the third section's surface-level differences. As I mentioned, one of my principal goals with this presentation has been to expand our understanding of Rachmaninoff's approach to conventional formal patterns in his post-1910 compositions. What I hope to have shown in particular is the increasing multivalence of Rachmaninoff's formal logic. That said, despite my explicit focus on the concept of rotational form, I do not wish to suggest there is or should be one conceptual framework that can account for this multivalence. Though I have found rotational theory to be an especially useful tool for the 3 works I discussed today, other works will demand different tools. Nonetheless, the growing body of literature on rotational form is helping us to appreciate the extent of its relevance, and as far as Rachmaninoff is concerned, I believe there's still a good more deal it has to offer. Thank you.
Stephen. Thanks so much for your paper. I noticed that in your application of rotational form, you're dealing with specific motives, whereas some of the prior applications of the concept of rotation applied to themes that just encompassed more material. And as a result of that, in some of your rotations, there are big gaps between the different motives that occur. So I'm just curious, from a methodological standpoint, how do you accommodate those sorts of gaps when there's non-rotational material in between the motives that you're identifying as participating in the rotations?
So I mean, I think it's across the kind of board and kind of the application of rotational theory, that is kind of pretty sort of built into it, is that whether you kind of accept that as sort of methodologically legitimate or not, I personally do think there is some legitimacy to the idea that you have a succession of motives or a succession of themes, and then in sort of recycling that, you can kind of put in gaps between them to insert intervening material. I mean, I think it's kind of a continuum. I think the legitimacy of kind of as it were, deforming the referential thematic pattern within rotations. You know, I think some of them, sometimes when that occurs in an analysis, I think it's pretty kind of legitimate as a way to kind of say, yes, there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this and this again, but with this little thing in between it. And I think other times when you start to get into some of the things that Habakkowski and Darcy others do in terms of writing over thematic ideas with different thematic ideas, this is where I think the real kind of debates about how far you can stretch the bounds of rotational theory come up. And so I think in the case of what I have here, so are you saying especially with that last example where I have kind of the things blocked out, or actually I guess with the B section, I will say with the Opus 33 number 8, the G minor A2, the B section, there I was kind of explicitly thinking of Habakkowski's analysis of Debussy's Nuage, which kind of, he doesn't have a diagram like that, but it's kind of implied that there are kind of big gaps in the rotations that allow for kind of, the kind of rotational process is continuing, but you have this kind of intervening idea in between. Yeah.
Thanks for a lovely paper. 3 of my favorite pieces. And actually, just as a parenthesis before I ask my question, I have to observe, I think I've been coming to theory conferences for 40 years now, and this is the first Rachmaninoff session ever. So in the words of a famous character, it's about bloody time.
Well, it's actually Ellen who we have to thank for this. Yeah. She's been the one working to get this to happen.
But it's excellent. It's long overdue. I wanted to ask a question about your figure 5, the G minor etude. It just seems, I find your reading very persuasive, and I think it leads to a very interesting way of reading the piece. But I'm also wondering if you considered the fact that you might want to arrange your rotations so that each rotation begins with C rather than ends with C, so that you have the cadence at the beginning, something like what you find in the minuet of the Jupiter Symphony. And that leads, I think, to maybe a somewhat more, well, less troubling reading, C to R, CSR, CSR, CS, CR, CS. So there's a kind of obvious parallelism there. I just wondered if you'd given that some thought.
So, yes, and actually what I did not have time, because I wanted to kind of talk about these 3 pieces, so I had to kind of skirt over a lot of things. And, you know, one thing that I find with Rachmaninoff, even before 1910, is he does kind of use kind of a cadential gesture at the outset. And the thing I kind of think is sort of the really kind of great example of this is the slow movement of the Second Symphony, where there's kind of that long melody that leads up to that kind of da-da-da-da-da that gets you to the cadence. But that's actually the opening of the movement, is that kind of big, huge cadential gesture. And so I actually would tie in what I kind of put here with actually stuff that Rachmaninoff is doing prior to the kind of post-1909 compositions. But I think that what I was trying to demonstrate, because yes, I mean, it is true that there is kind of a sort of real interpretive overlay, and we're kind of stacking the deck, I guess, in the way that I presented it on the page in terms of kind of lining everything up. But what I was specifically trying to capture with that is within the first 2 rotations, this idea that they are I think at least kind of retrospectively kind of starting midstream. That, you know, we hear that initial cadential gesture at the outset, but we hear it as kind of an initiating gesture. It's what's opening things up. But then we hear the kind of what I'm calling R and C, and it kind of, you know, R is kind of very ambiguous to me when I hear that for the first time. It sounds as though it's following C as kind of a response to that, but then later on I kind of hear that as more of sort of starting something new, again, kind of retrospectively once I've heard everything. And then when I get to the third rotation, but as I'm listening to that, I have a real sense that those two previous, the previous statements of C and of R were this kind of midstream. And so I would say that what I'm trying to really capture with the way that I'm laying out the diagram is this kind of retrospective interpretation that I end up getting of especially the first two rotations kind of starting midstream.
There will be a handout for the next talk as well, if there's some in the back. Thanks for helping her out. Thank you so much. And it will be handout, audio, and speaking, no projector. Great. And piano. I heard you practicing, which is wonderful. Thanks for playing. You don't hear enough piano in these things. Our next talk, I think, will have interesting resonances as we move to thinking about cadences in Rachmaninoff. Our second speaker is Bakulina. Ellen is an assistant professor of music theory at the University of North Texas. She has degrees from the City University of New York, McGill University, and the College of the Moscow Tchaikovsky Conservatory. She has taught at UNT, CUNY, McGill, and at Yale. Her areas of interest include Schenkerian analysis, theories of form and meter and tonal music, the music of Rachmaninoff, and the Russian music theoretical tradition. Her articles have appeared or will soon appear in several journals, including the Canadian journal Intersections, Music Theory Online, the Journal of Music Theory, Integral, and Theoria. The title of her paper today is Disguised Cadences in Rachmaninoff Songs. Please welcome it.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your introduction, Blair. And I'm very happy that this session is happening. No doubt it is possible to regard the form and harmony of early 20th century music on their own terms. Still, for many musicians trained in the common practice tradition, it would probably make intuitive sense to view this repertoire from the standpoint of established tonal patterns. It is from this standpoint that I first started to look at Sergei Rachmaninoff's solo songs, romances, asking myself in every piece, where is the final cadence? In many cases, no obvious answer arose. My paper today is an attempt to develop several more complex answers to this question. In music theory, recent years have witnessed a surge of interest in the cadence, mostly in the 18th century. My paper today explores cadential structures in late and post-romantic music, with an emphasis on the relatively late Opus 38. I explore the 34. I explore the strategies Rachmaninoff used in his solo songs to obscure or conceal familiar cadential patterns. Combining form-functional and linear analytical approaches, I show several specific forms this concealment of cadences takes. First option, a tonic pedal obscures a cadential progression. Second option, a familiar cadential progression, such as, for example, 5-1, migrates to a middle ground structural level. And option number 3, established cadential progressions are completely discarded. I consider these types of compositional experimentation part and parcel of a larger phenomenon, the increasingly loose-knit formal structures in late Romantic repertoires. I should mention a shared feature of many of the Opus 34 songs. Thanks to an extremely slow harmonic rhythm, an authentic or plagal cadence somewhere towards the end is often the only cadence on one in the piece. Therefore, for the most part, the dominant or subdominant harmony of the cadential progressions I'll be discussing is often the background dominant or subdominant in a Schenkerian sense. My starting theoretical point is William Kaplan's conceptual distinction between three things: the cadential function, which is an area of form, the cadential progression, which is a series of chords, and the cadential arrival, a single point in time. Cadential function refers to the time span that, quote, immediately precedes the cadential arrival, whose formal purpose is to announce a cadence is forthcoming, end of quote. This is from Kaplan's 2004 article on the cadence in Jams. In order for the cadential function to be realized, at least in the classical repertoire, a cadential harmonic progression needs to occur. Example 1 shows selected authentic cadential progressions from the classical repertoire, most of which begin with a 1/6 chord and proceed to a predominant, dominant, and tonic, the cadential arrival. In all the progressions that I'm showing here, the bass goes mi, fa, sol, do, 3, 4, 5, 1. This formula corresponds to the cadenza lunga from the partimento tradition. I also need to specify that by the time of late Romanticism, of course, the plagal cadence sometimes gets full closural weight as well. The theories I have mentioned so far describe 18th century styles. However, even in Rachmaninoff, the cadential function is still often expressed by directly obvious cadential progression. And Kaplan's three categories, cadential function, progression, and arrival, comfortably and obviously coincide. A selection of such relatively simple cases is shown in example 2. Two of these feature authentic cadences, one perfect and one imperfect. The third one is actually less straightforward. It features a plagal cadence, somewhat complicated by a surface fully diminished sonority. Just a little note, my identification of perfect and imperfect authentic cadences in this case relies on the voice part. I will quickly play and sing the three cases in example 2. So PAC based on what the voice part is doing. And then an IAC based on what the voice is doing. And then a plagal progression. This is a much later song from Opus 38. In other cases, however, one observes Rachmaninoff's tendency to experiment with cadences. One such experimental case is shown in example 3, the migrant wind, Ветер перелетный, from Opus 34. The song exemplifies important features of Rachmaninoff's mid to late style, and Stephen talked about the dividing points in Rachmaninoff's output a little bit. So this is the post-1910 part of his output. Important features of Rachmaninoff's mid to late style, including extreme and virtually unpredictable chromaticism, very slow harmonic rhythm, and pedal points, which obscure not only cadences, but often formal functionality in general. The text describes a motion from darkness to light, both literally and metaphorically. To reflect this motion, Rachmaninoff's setting modulates from A minor to C major, featuring progressive or directional tonality. Robert Bailey's term. Each of the relative keys, A and C, receives a harmonic progression veiled by a tonic pedal, and each ends with a 5-1 motion, where the last accented syllable of the poetic line falls on the tonic arrival. Therefore, for both textual and harmonic reasons, I maintain that the final tonic in each case is a true cadential arrival. Each of these cadences concludes a textual and a musical phrase as a unit of harmonic motion. This is William Rothstein's definition of phrase in tonal music. Example 3 shows the second C major cadential region as a score and a graph. If one discards the tonic pedal, starting in measure 38, which exists at a deeper structural level, a conventional cadential progression emerges. It includes an augmented 6 chord, 5 embellished with a cadential 6/4, and 1. Let's listen to the example starting at 38. And then there is some post-cadential material. So the middle ground progression that I'm showing, discarding the tonic pedal, is in fact it's not in the middle ground, it's on the surface. The vocal cadential arrival on 1 accompanies a structural descent 3-2-1 in the tenor register in the piano, as you will see in my graph. Of course, the progression also allows for another reading, a plagal motion of the augmented 6 chord to 1 in measure 39, in which case the focal phrase «День сильнее ночи», day is stronger than night, would be post-cadential. The next few examples involve cadential progressions hidden beneath a surface seemingly unrelated to any standardized patterns. My argument here is that a familiar cadential progression recedes to a middle ground level. Example 4 presents The Raising of Lazarus, Воскресение Лазаря, also from Opus 34. A complete score also appears on pages 5 and 6 of the handout. Actually, if you're willing to take the handout apart and look at the score and the graph, that might help. In the poem, the protagonist likens him or herself to Lazarus from the Gospel of St. John and prays to God that he may raise to life his or her soul in a spiritual sense. Rachmaninoff's intensely tragic and recitative-like setting begins and ends firmly in F minor. The opening, with a minor 5 chord subtly referencing church music, reaches a half cadence in measure 8. Next, one may choose to hear another half cadence in measure 19. I claim, however, that this 5 chord in 19 is not a half cadence, but the beginning of a 5-1 progression that provides full harmonic closure and formal closure for the piece. My graph in example 4 unearths, so to speak, this progression from under the convoluted surface in measures 18 through 22. Let me perform this bit. I will start a little bit before measure 15. At the 5 harmony, the underlying harmonic rhythm dramatically slows down, and the bass line, representing the structural descent, steadily moves by steps to the goal tonic. The awkwardly leaping voice line accompanies this descent with its top notes 7-1, I mean leading tone to tonic, structurally and inner voice. The tonic downbeat of measure 22 is a full cadential arrival in all voices. The textural bass is actually displaced by a quarter note to the left. Granted, this reading of the cadential arrival is somewhat weakened by an elision, because measure 22 also begins a new vocal phrase. But this is not unlike an elided cadence in a classical sonata, where an essential expositional closure, for instance, is often elided with the following material. A cadential progression similarly buried at a middle ground level is found in Song 9 from the same opus, Ты знал его, you knew him well, see example 5. I will play a recording right away. It starts almost at the same place where the example starts. Some post-cadential material. In this highly chromatic piece, the long obscure tonal center D major and what I read as the Kopf tone 3 F sharp arrive toward the end in measure 24. At this point, the moon in the text, metaphorically representing the poet, begins to shine. From here on, the middle ground progression suggests plagal closure, the progression 4 with an added 6 to 1. With the low bass notes G, D articulating the background harmonies. Measures 24-27 thus represent the cadential function, and 27 through the end are post-cadential. Like in Lazarus, but to a greater extent, the progression is disguised by surface stepwise motion in the piano's outer voices, with a melodically adventurous voice part. The middle ground counterpoint is very interesting. My graph shows a descending 3-2-1 line in the voice part, and also there is an anticipation, so the 1 arrives earlier than the harmony tonic. In contrary motion with an ascending 1-2-3 line in the piano, in the alto register. The ascending line is very important. The 1-2-3 or do re mi motion supported by 4-1 in the bass has been viewed as essential for plagal progressions, at least since Rameau. It's what he calls cadence irrégulière in the traité. In Rachmaninoff's songs, the ascending line may perhaps be heard as symbolizing the rising moon. That's just one possibility. So the middle ground progression goes like this. I wish to briefly mention one more example with a middle ground plagal cadential progression. I remember that day, сей день я помню, 34 number 10, also known as the Morn of Life. A score is provided at the very end of the handout if you can look at the very last page of the score handout. My annotations show a plagal cadence just below the surface. A subdominant harmony enters as a diatonic 2-6 chord in measure 16 and evolves into a half-diminished harmony before resolving to the A-flat major tonic. I will quickly play that bit. Measure 16. Progression goes. I now come to my last example, the song Arion from the same opus, which also contains stepwise surface motion. But unlike the previous songs where a familiar cadential progression transpires at some level, here in Arion, this motion disguises no cadential progression at all. See example 6. Pushkin's poem Arion about seafarers inspired Rachmaninoff's fascinating text painting of sea waves. Counterpointing the waves of the right-hand part, the left hand plays a longer wave-like line, which I will call the C motive, in the piano introduction, measures 3 to 7. Let's hear it. C motive in the left hand. Thank you. At the end of the song, the C motive comes back in the final phrase of the voice part, an area of form where one would expect the final cadence. Now extended by a few measures with respect to its introductory statement, the motive painstakingly avoids a dominant chord. Instead, with the arrival on 1 in the left hand and in the voice in measure 64, the wave-like accompaniment never gives up its inner voice tone, D. Thus, the 5 harmony never materializes. Instead, it's a prolongation of 1 all the time. Let's hear that bit. Listen to the D in the middle voice. And there is a very long post-cadential, or you might say coda, section. My recomposition on the bottom right part of example 6 shows what would have happened if a dominant chord had emerged. So what actually happens is this. So what would happen if there was some kind of authentic progression? And then we probably would hear it as that, but it does not happen. I emphasize that the formal function of end is clearly expressed, but the cadential arrival at measure 64 is a purely melodic one, not harmonic. This is what Kaplan, in his recent article Beyond the Classical Cadence in Music Theory Spectrum, calls prolongational closure. The function of measure 64 as a cadential arrival is further confirmed by the lengthy tonic pedal that follows for 20 measures, no less. Thus, a cadential function expressed by the melodic descent in what we just heard is dissociated from a cadential progression, as we know it from the tonal tradition. And a few words about the larger context of this cadence. Arion is one of the longer songs in Rachmaninoff's output, and where one should identify the work's structural end is not entirely clear. One candidate for the structural end is the event right before the passage with the C motive that we just heard. It is a 5-7-1 progression where the 5 lacks a third. There is neither C sharp nor C natural. The problem with this progression as the work's final closure is that it arrives seemingly mid-phrase, and we actually heard that in the recording, and may only retrospectively be reinterpreted as the structural cadence. If one does interpret a true cadence with the 5-7-1 progression, then the C motive in my example will be understood as post-cadential. The ambiguity of formal function in this passage indicates some of the larger scale issues that a consideration of late Romantic cadences involves. In summary, I have discussed 2 ways in which Rachmaninoff obscures standard cadential progressions, by pedal points and by articulating these progressions at a middle ground level. I have also shown an example where cadential progression is completely avoided. At least that is one possible hearing. To conclude, I wish to mention Janet Schmalfeldt's work on form. Like her, I have joined a formal and a Schenkerian linear approach in my paper, but I have done so in a more limited way than she has. I have tried to map, where it is logically and musically possible, a certain type of progression and formal function onto an area of middle ground level in a piece. I hope that my analyses illustrate how a Schenkerian approach helps uncover underlying familiar structures hidden by idiosyncratic surfaces. Thank you. Nathan and then Charles.
Thank you very much. I found the analyses really utterly convincing. So my question is about precedents for Rachmaninoff's practice. And the composer who is coming to mind for me is Wagner, because for him, especially using a cadence with four, some sort of, with a passing motion, maybe to one, and a flattened third, is quite common for closing gestures, but very often there's a cadence with a five before that. And I wonder whether it's possible that Rachmaninoff, and I'm sure many other composers at the last part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, simply got rid of the need for the cadence with the five. And you know, I'm thinking about Bruckner in this regard too. All of his codas have these cadences with the four. I don't think that would be so much of an influence for Rachmaninoff, but I'm sure there are plenty of other potential sources that I'm not aware of. So,
thank you, Nathan, for your question. Maybe it's possible to regard a plagal cadence as 5-1-4-1 with the 5-1 discarded, so only 4-1 remains. As we know, and several scholars have written about that, including, actually, I have a footnote here that I did not read, including Kevin Swind and Deborah Stein, and two people who have written on Russian music, specifically Zavlunov and Frolov Walker. All of those have, in one way or another, said that, oh, and also I should add Daniel Harrison, should have said in one way or another that the plagal cadence increases in importance towards the end of the 19th century. Whether that simply means that we get rid of the five or not, that may be a matter for disagreement. I have the plagal cadences that I found so far too, well, those that I have shown in Rachmaninoff songs are quite ambiguous, actually, I find. I have honestly tried to find an authentic and a plagal cadence and found the plagal works better. In the poet, you knew him well, especially the deep G is so deep and important, and it just stands out so much that maybe ultimately in this piece perhaps it's unambiguous, but most of these examples with where plagalism sort of comes up, it's not always so straightforward. But I will say one more thing about plagal progressions in Russian music. Both people that I have mentioned already, Daniil Zavlunov and Marina Frolova-Walker, have written about how in Russian and Soviet scholarship, people have sort of overemphasized almost the importance of plagalism in Russian music. And both of these people actually say that no, it's not so much a Russian phenomenon, it's actually a broader thing that happens in, well, probably in late Romanticism, especially. Charles.
great collection of examples. I want to start with an observation and then a question. It strikes me, from having struggled with this stuff myself a lot, that your example one, the sort of model of cadential progressions that you're working with, I think it's really important not to forget that these are progressions that were designed for analytical use in music that's 120 years before Rachmaninoff. So we're 6 generations away. One of the reasons I like Rachmaninoff is that you get the sense that he's kind of running a laboratory for inventing new progressions and new models of harmonic syntax. And I think we have a real problem when we look at his music, trying to recognize things, because we really don't have convenient labels for them. We're not trained to recognize them, so they're effectively invisible. We can't really see them. I think you've been really ingenious in trying to find some of those conventional models, but I would draw your attention to just in example 5 from Tisnalievo. The progression across the bar line from measure 23 to 24, in root fundamental bass terms, that looks like a half diminished 7th chord on A going to a D major tonic. That's actually a really common progression that Rachmaninoff uses all the time. It's in the 3rd movement of the 2nd concerto. It's in the middle movement of the 3rd concerto. It's one of his favorite progressions. And I'm just wondering if maybe you can get yourself to the place where that becomes a progression that can bear cadential weight. Notice it's really hard to describe that progression if you are addicted to Roman numerals and fundamental bass. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense in Roman numeral terms. We may need a different language for describing chords that do this. But I'm wondering if you could hear perhaps an alternative reading of this passage that would see that as the definitive arrival on tonic, and then what happens through the next 3 measures as a kind of plagal working out of that tonic.
Post-cadential it would be. Thank you so much. That I think that's a possibility. 2 problems that I would have with measures 23 to 24 as cadence. First, the absence of C sharp. And perhaps the progression that you described does not need the leading tone.
That's the point. That doesn't
perhaps that's the point. Okay. That would require sort of training to hear that as a cadence. And another thing, the bass that goes for a long time by step, and that progression sort of almost is drowned in that scalar motion in the bass. But definitely that's a possibility. And definitely the D major tonic arrival is very strong, and perhaps one could use the term from a different field of study, emergent tonality, when we don't know what key we are in, and then suddenly at that what you would hear as cadence, there is this D major tonic, and then everything else would be post-cadential.
I'm just throwing it out as a possibility.
Thank you.
No handout.
There is no handout.
Okay. We could do that.
Just click the volume icon down there and we'll know. That's on zip.
Yeah. It's getting there. Hello.
As the screen comes to life, we introduce our 3rd speaker. Simon Prosser is a PhD candidate at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. His dissertation, which he will defend this spring, reconsiders the nature of tonal hierarchy from both a Schenkerian and a schema-theoretic perspective. Alongside his dissertation research, Simon has pursued a study of harmony and modality in the music of Shostakovich. He has presented his research at numerous regional and national conferences. Simon teaches at Hunter College and the Mannes School of Music. His talk today, Rachmaninoff, Taneev, and horizontal shifting counterpoint. Please welcome Simon Prosser.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for staying. I'm the very last paper on the conference, and thank you to Ellen for making this happen. I'm very grateful. All right. Here we have two passages from Rachmaninoff's Études-tableaux, Opus 33, number 4, or number 5, depending on how you're counting. Each passage counterpoints the same two melodic lines, which I've labeled here as voices 1 and 2, Roman numeral 1 and 2. But in the second passage, while both voices are transposed up a fourth, their temporal alignment with respect to each other is different. Voice 2 has been shifted so that it begins 1/4 note later than before. Let's hear these passages, and the pianist playing is Sviatoslav Richter. And the second passage. And of course, those are what Stephen called the spotlight motives from rotations 1 and 2. Here are first species reductions of these two passages. I've shown the intervals between voices 1 and 2 with boldface numbers. As you can see, Rachmaninoff's counterpoint isn't entirely kosher with respect to traditional contrapuntal rules, given the parallel fifths that result in the shifted passage. Nevertheless, the intervals of the shifted passage are all consonant. Notice that the intervals of the second passage can be derived from the first by measuring the intervals between each cross-related pair of notes at a distance of 1/4 note. And I've shown these intervals with dotted lines labeling those intervals in italics. Rachmaninoff's little bit of contrapuntal sorcery here may betray his studies with Sergei Taneev. Taneev's 1909 treatise, Movable Counterpoint in the Strict Style, theorizes two types of movable or shifting counterpoint. Vertical shifting counterpoint, in which the voices of a combination are shifted up or down relative to each other, and horizontal shifting counterpoint, in which the voices are shifted to the left or right relative to each other, as seen in Rachmaninoff's Études-tableaux. Taneev's theory of vertical shifting counterpoint is a generalization of the theory of invertible counterpoint. Chris Siegel's 2014 article in Music Theory Online provides an excellent summary of Taneev's vertical shifting counterpoint, so I won't say anything more about it here other than to point out that it very systematically formulates a comprehensive set of rules for the composition of vertical shifting counterpoint. By comparison, I think Taneev's theory of horizontal shifting counterpoint feels less comprehensive and systematic. This is Taneev's first demonstration of horizontal shifting counterpoint. A two-voice canon at the unison is counterpointed with a third voice, and I believe the example is from Palestrina, although he doesn't indicate what piece. Taneev singles out two separate two-voice combinations within this canon, one with the proposta and counterpoint, and one with the risposta and counterpoint, to show how the counterpoint can be aligned with the same melody at two different time points. Comparing the second combination to the first would reveal that the counterpoint has been shifted 2 breves to the left. In Taneev's system, horizontal shifts by positive values represent either leftward shifts of voice 1 or rightward shifts of voice 2, and shifts by negative values represent either rightward shifts of voice 1 or leftward shifts of voice 2. So here, you could say that voice 2 would be shifted by -2 breves. The sum of all horizontal shifts between two voices is what Taneev, calls the index of horizontal shift, which he designates as JH. So in this example, the value of JH is -2 breves. Note that, again, that the intervals of the second two-part combination could be derived from the first by measuring the intervals between each cross-related pair of notes at a distance of 2 breves, the index of horizontal shift, JH. While Taneev's concept of an index of horizontal shift provides a consistent and compact way to categorize horizontal shifts, it doesn't actually tell us very much about horizontal shifting counterpoint, and crucially, it doesn't obtain any principles or rules that we could follow to compose our own horizontal shifting counterpoint. Instead, as Dennis Collins points out, in his counterpoint classes, Taneev recommended that his students first write a 3-part texture, which he called the basic version, where one motive is heard against 2 iterations of the other motive. And that's exactly what we see in that Palestrina example. We can see that very same approach in this early work by Rachmaninoff, written when he was still a student at the Moscow Conservatory, and my thanks to Ellen Bakulina for bringing this piece to my attention. It's obviously in the conservative polyphonic vocal style of Taneev's model for his treatise, The Music of Palestrina. When Rachmaninoff begins a 2-voice point of imitation, he counterpoints it with a 3rd voice, thereby creating a basic version in which one counterpoint can accompany the same line at 2 different time points, for which Taneev might designate a JH value of -1 whole note. Again, note that the intervals of the shifted combination are apparent from the cross-related pairs of notes at this time point interval. And also note that this example combines horizontal shifting with vertical shifting, which is quite common, and Taneev would call that double shifting counterpoint. Oh, whoops. Got a little ahead. So what I'd like to do today is suggest a systematic model for composing horizontal shifting counterpoint. To do this, I've worked out a template for composing a 2-part first species horizontal shifting combination according to traditional Fuchsian rules of counterpoint. This template represents 2 pairs of notes at 2 time points in a combination. They're not adjacent to each other, they're at separate times. And I've represented them with the Arabic numerals 1 and 2. Each pair of notes is a simultaneity made up of a note from voice 1 and a note from voice 2, and I label those with Roman numerals as Taneev does. The time point interval between notes 1 and 2 is equivalent to JH, the index of horizontal shift by which the combination will be shifted, which I quantify as a number of note durations, according to Taneev's system. Depending on which voice is to be shifted and the direction of the shift, JH will be either positive or negative, again according to Taneev's system. To compose a horizontal shifting counterpoint, we start by selecting a value for JH, the direction and distance of the shift. Then we make our choices for note 1 in each voice to determine that initial simultaneity, which I designate V1. Let's go with 2 Cs forming an octave. Now we reach the crucial step. As I have been highlighting in my examples, the intervals of the shifted combination can be derived from the original by measuring the intervals between each cross-related pair of notes separated by JH, the time point interval of the shift. These cross-relation intervals are the most important for composing horizontal shifting counterpoint because they will become the intervals of the shifted combination. In my template, X represents the cross-relation interval. X positive is for positive values of JH, and X negative is for negative values of JH. To ensure that the intervals of the shifted combination will be consonant in accordance with the rules of first species counterpoint, X must always be consonant. This constrains the movement from note 1 to note 2 in one of the voices. Assuming a positive value for JH, This means that the motion from voice 1's C is limited to notes that are consonant with the C in voice 2. Moving to E in voice 1 would create a consonant cross-relation interval. Voice 2's note 2 may then be any note consonant with voice 1's note 2. For a negative shift, a negative value of x negative, it would be the movement of voice 2 that is limited to notes that form a consonant cross-relation interval. The need to maintain a consonant cross-relation interval means that for each of the possible values of V1, only a small number of options for movement are available. This table summarizes them all. There are 4 main sections, one for each consonant simple interval, the octave, the third, the fifth, and the sixth, each of those representing the possible values of V1. And since the cross-relation intervals, x positive or x negative, are also limited to consonant intervals, then for each V1 interval, I show only 4 possible options for movement in whichever voice is constrained. For positive shifts, the motion of voice 1 is constrained, and for negative shifts, the motion of voice 2 is constrained. I also show the notes that the other voice will be able to move to. So, for a demonstration, I'll show you how I used my template to compose a horizontal shifting bass counterpoint to this cantus firmus. The resemblance to Fuchs's D minor is accidental. Subconscious, I guess. Since I have to begin with the octave because I'm starting the counterpoint, I had to reject values of JH that would not create a consonant cross relation given the movement of the cantus firmus. I ended up deciding on +3 breves for my JH. As I composed my counterpoint, I would check that both V1 and X positive were always consonant. Sometimes I had to avoid certain choices if they would create voice leading errors in the shifted combination, because I'm not Rachmaninoff and I can not just write parallel fifths. Fortunately, the rest of the counterpoint was easy to compose, and what I'd like to do is for us to sing it. So I guess we'll just do high voices on the cantus firmus and low voices on the counterpoint. I'll just play a D minor cadence. And I'll give you 4 whole notes to comment. 1, 2, pardon? If you just pick high voice, sing the upper part, low voice, sing the lower part, whichever one you want.
We're doing the original combination.
The original. First example. Okay.
Yeah, we're gonna do this, and then we're gonna do this.
Okay.
Not all at once.
One, two, three, 4. Now, so using this first species counterpoint as a framework, I was also able to compose a 5th species horizontal shifting counterpoint to this cantus firmus, incorporating all sorts of dissonances, including suspensions. And I did it in just kind of an ad hoc kind of way. A next step in this would be, coming up with a method for other species that would allow me to incorporate dissonances in a systematic way. But I think this worked out, so let's sing this too. So again, original combination first, then shifted combination. And maybe we should slow it down a little bit. So I'll count 2 beats per bar. 1, 2, 1, that in the shifted combination, that long series of parallel thirds is more acceptable in the 5th species context, where you can do things to increase the variety. Anyway. Anyway, so the theory of horizontal shifting counterpoint, I believe, has applications far beyond these very basic demonstrations. In particular, just as Taneev's concept of vertical shifting counterpoint can be regarded as a generalization of the techniques of invertible or double counterpoint, I believe that we should regard this concept of horizontal shifting counterpoint as a generalization of the techniques of canon or stretto. I don't have time to explore this idea here, but I will point out some citations that are relevant that you'll see in my bibliography at the end. There's an article by Robert Morris, a very recent video on SMTV by Scott Murphy, and both of those are on composing canons. And both of those actually were brought to my attention by my colleague Charles Weaver. And there's also an article by Dennis Collins in Music Theory Online on horizontal shifting counterpoint in J.S. Bach's Art of the Fugue. To conclude, I'd like to bring the focus back to Rachmaninoff. One of the goals of this panel has been to provoke us to reevaluate the received images we might have of Rachmaninoff as a composer. The panel's abstract provides one such image, Rachmaninoff the traditionalist chained to outdated compositional methods. It could be argued that my own paper hasn't done much to challenge this image, given that it suggests that Rachmaninoff's traditionalist conservatory training in the outdated compositional methods of species counterpoint seems to have had an impact on his compositions. But the thing is, outside of canon and stretto, I think horizontal shifting counterpoint is quite a rare, little discussed technique. So I referred to Collins. So Dennis Collins admits that he is aware of no other counterpoint text, historical or modern, that provides a systematic account of the technique of horizontal shifting counterpoint. And for this reason, commentators on contrapuntal repertoire may be at a loss to adequately describe events involving this technique. In this regard, Collins cites Donald Francis Tovey's discussion from a 1931 discussion of the following passages from Contrapunctus 8 of the Art of the Fugue, in which, like Rachmaninoff's Études-tableaux, 2 passages present the same pair of subjects in counterpoint, but at 2 different temporal alignments. In the first passage, Collins points out how the subject that he labels S2 consistently begins after the subject S1. But in the second passage, S2 begins before S1, meaning it has been shifted to the left. Here's the audio, and the pianist, or I should say organist in this case, is Glenn Gould. And then the second passage. Okay. Collins points out that Tovey was perplexed by the order of voice entries and their pitch levels in the latter passage. Tovey claimed that, and he quotes Tovey directly here, the abnormality of this relation consists in the fact that the measure 125 entry is not only at a different pitch, which in itself would mean an inversion in a double counterpoint other than at the octave, but that it combines at a different point, a device for which the books have no name. Collins believes that Tovey lacked the theoretical framework to interpret this passage's surface details or to judge its overall structural significance, noting that it is almost certain that Tovey had no knowledge of Taneev's work. For Collins, the moment at which, in the Bach, at which S1 and S2 are presented in a new temporal alignment represents arguably the most heightened level of contrapuntal activity in the work. Paradoxically, then, it could be said that Rachmaninoff availed himself of a traditional, outdated compositional method that had apparently never been described before his teacher Taneev's treatise, and thus could hardly be said to be traditional at all, let alone outdated. And yet, J.S. Bach himself seems to have been aware of it and capable of exploiting the possibilities of horizontal shifting counterpoint. It's usually the case that theory lags behind practice, such that to be a music theorist is to be constantly playing a game of catch-up. In beginning to theorize horizontal shifting counterpoint and analyze its use in music, we may finally be catching up to something that seems to have been a part of contrapuntal technique since not only the time of J.S. Bach, but also Palestrina, and I wouldn't be surprised if before. And in reconsidering the received image of Rachmaninoff, and I might add other Russian composers and theorists, as outdated, we should appreciate that he and Taneev were already way ahead of us. Thank you.
Hi, this is super exciting. I think it's about time somebody did this. We always knew it was there, and nobody bothered to systematize it. One of my colleagues, Christoph Neidhofer, wrote about the Taneev a little bit.
Oh, okay, good.
Actually, he didn't write about it. I think he just gave a paper here on it. But it's really wonderful to see this kind of systematized. I don't think I'm going to actually use it in my classes right away.
Well, I'll say one thing. A couple days ago, literally a couple days ago, I came up with a much more straightforward and user-friendly way of doing it. And I don't have time to explain it here, but there's at least for first species, there's a simpler way to do it that doesn't involve this unwieldy template that I've developed. This is I thought of this a few years ago. So there is an easier way to do it. If that's,
okay, well, send it along.
Yeah.
I just had a tiny remark, which is that in both the Palestrina example and the early Rachmaninoff example, there were repetitions within the lines. So there was like little motives that repeated. One had it transposed down by steps. That was the Rachmaninoff, and the other was in the Palestrina. There was repetition, and I'm sure that makes it a lot easier if you work that into line 2 or whichever one it is.
So are you referring to the fact that they were kind of, you might call them sequentially organized?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
because that's going to make it a lot easier with the imitation at the unison.
Exactly. Absolutely.
I'm not saying they're cheated, but
yeah. No. It definitely makes things. As with writing, it's easy to write a canon within a sequence. You can do it in a circle of fifth sequence. You can do it in an ascending fifth sequence. And those were sort of common, like ready-made ways to create canons. And yeah, horizontal shifting counterpoint is a little bit easier when you are working with just a small model that you can then just replicate as many times as you want.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your paper, Simon. And I did think about Peter Schubert and his work on improvised counterpoint when Simon showed the schemes. Just a very little note about the parallel fifths and the first example. I mean, yes, Rachmaninoff is using a technique that people have known for centuries, but he is adapting or changing, or whatever you might say, it for some kind of new context. Yeah. I think he's much less, I mean, it's a tiny little example, just two intervals, but it shows you that he's much less constrained by, Fuchs-like and related systems of rules compositionally. So he is innovating.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's part, like there's lots of parallel fifths in that etude, and I certainly don't mean to say that it's a sign of him being a sloppy composer or something like that. Right. It's very much part of the kind of music he's trying to create. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hey.
Excellent paper. So one thing I noticed when you're listing the intervals is that you chose not to use Taneev's system, where the octave would be a 7 and not an 8.
Oh yeah. Well.
And so yeah.
I don't think any of us want to call octaves 7s.
Right, yeah. but when you do that, the arithmetic works out for vertical shifting counterpoint.
Yeah, it's very convenient for the vertical shifting counterpoint calculations, but I guess I didn't see any reason to use it here. But
yeah, well, I'm sort of wondering. I mean, so this book, I guess, was translated in 1962, but hasn't really.
And that's a terrible translation, by the way. So that's part of the reason why Chris Siegel created the article that he did. He read the original Russian and provided a much better summary of it. Yeah.
And I'm wondering too if part of the reception of Taneev's work, when I was reading the vertical shifting, it was like, wow, this is so awesome, and it makes sense, and I can shift in many different ways, and I can actually calculate it, and it makes sense with this new thing. But it requires us to completely rethink how we see intervals, right? It's no longer an octave, an 8, it's a 7, and that's maybe one of the reasons that it hasn't been widely adopted, because we have to start again from the beginning before we have to do this. What's your take on that?
Well, I guess, so is the question why hasn't Taneev's system of interval labeling been adopted, or what?
Well, I guess just large scale, Taneev hasn't made a big appearance in
part
in
of
my
it is that he's
education.
Russian. Part of it is that he's Russian. And that there's only this poor translation of his work, and so I think perhaps the difficulty of changing our way of thinking about intervals is part of what makes the adoption of his vertical shifting counterpoint theory more difficult. As for this, I mean, I don't think I have an answer. It's a besides the fact that, for obvious reasons, American music theory doesn't necessarily pay attention to Russian music theory. But hopefully that'll begin to change, yeah. But already the fact, like Dennis Collins publishing his article and things like that, referring explicitly to Taneev, I think that's already a sign that things are changing.